Number 10. Population. Here's the thing, folks. When you do the whole slave thing, you may need more than one. Maybe two. Okay, 10 tops. No more than that. Okay, maybe like thousands. Yes, this was true of ancient Rome. While it is difficult to calculate the exact number of people who were slaves, some historians speculate that at least 10% of the population were slaves. And if that number doesn't feel right to you, it's because some say it could really be as high as 20%. That's a lot of folks. And honestly, if we're to study history and understand the mistakes of the past, well, having that many slaves means there's probably more people to join in the angry mob and the revolts, because you have slaves and people don't like that. Number 9. The act itself. I know I didn't have to tell you this, but I'm gonna tell you anyway. The act itself. Now, just an idea, and this is gonna make some corporate overlords faint, but when I say this, maybe we shouldn't put our fellow man in chains and shackles and be forced to complete hard labor for no wage and they're treated like dirt. Just an idea. Less than dirt, actually, sometimes. Look, I know sometimes we as humans don't get along. As a Canadian, playing hockey in school always changed my behavior. I think Chris would agree with this too. We could be the sweetest students ever, but when we get out of that rink, something changes. You start seeing Stanley Cups and Maple Leafs, and probably a forced deal with a very popular coffee shop chain. But all that seething Canadian rage never made me want to treat people the way slaves were treated. What I'm getting at is, even at our worst, we would never do that. I wouldn't do that, Chris wouldn't do that, we're not gonna do that. Number 8. Work to work. I guess one slightly good thing about being a Roman slave is that, well, if you could even call a good thing in that, really, is that there was a chance to work for your freedom. Literally slaving away in the hot Roman sun for years just so you can get your freedom, so you can work and sweat in the hot Roman sun for years for very little pay. And that's so great when you put it that way. I hope there's a sunscreen budget. Some slaves could buy their freedom, some were freed by their masters, and getting freed was actually a big deal, as there was sometimes a ceremony where a slave and then a public official would touch the head of the slave of the staff. Abracadabra, alakazam, wishy-washy, sloshy, poof. Magic, you're free now. So simple, right? Almost like it didn't have to happen in the first place. Huh? Number 7. Second-class citizen. You may have heard this term thrown around a little bit, but becoming a citizen of Rome was kind of a big deal. Your social status kind of defined how you lived. You'd think being a slave sweating away in the Mediterranean sun wasn't bad enough. There was a lot of red tape to go with this as well. So many rules. When freeing slaves, no more than 100 at a time could be freed. Okay, but I have a few issues with that. If your house has 100 slaves, you probably ain't gonna give up 100 in the first place. Now the rule says under no circumstances can you free 100 slaves at one time. Okay, what if you break it up? Say you do 50 at a time. What if you do 99 slaves and leave one until later? What if you release one at 11:59 and then the rest at midnight? What if some of the slaves are missing limbs from hard labor and only count as half? Let's say you release 99 and one half slaves at 11:59 and the last half at midnight. You see what I'm saying? There's too many rules. I can't deal with that, man. Too many rules. No. Number 6. Foundation. Okay, everyone loves Rome. Who doesn't? You got your legions, you got your Colosseums, you got your aqueducts. Oh, it's a big deal. As it turns out, the Romans were good at building stuff. Most impressive, honestly, was their roads. I know that's not as cool as the buildings, but trust me, anyone who actually knows architecture in the comments is gonna quietly nod their head and agree with me, and so yeah, he's right, actually, yeah. Roman roads last 2,000 years. Toronto is still waiting for the Eglinton Crosstown. That's a local inside joke, but trust me, it'll slap. Where the hell is that thing? Come on. The point I'm getting at is Romans built a lot of great stuff, and it could not have been so without the efforts of the many slaves who built their roads, tended their farms, and did just about everything, honestly. It was built on the whole thing. Number 5. Roman numerals. Attack of the math. Look, I don't want to give the Romans too much credit, but gosh darn, I guess they did a lot. Sure, we don't use their numbers in regular life today, but they still appear in places once in a while. Like the Star Wars movies, they use them. They have titles and names, and sometimes just to confuse students when trying to tell time. Sometimes the clocks have Roman numerals on them for some reason. For once, that was something actually I didn't struggle with in school. Who would have thought? The Roman numeral system is based on certain letters representing ones and tens until it gets into larger denominations, and more letters get thrown in. Basically, anything from 1 to 1,000, you're good. You're doing great. After that, you're gonna need some more papyrus. I had enough trouble with algebra and adding some letters to my numbers in math class, but now my numbers are actually just letters? Whoa, I don't think so, cowboy. I didn't sign up for that. Nope. I'll be in drama class. Much easier. I'm not going to math class. I'm going to drama class. Nope. Number 4, the Julian calendar. Imagine being such a mighty and powerful leader that you get a calendar named after you. Yes, the Julian calendar is named after Julius Caesar, the man, the myth, the legend. You might be thinking to yourself, well, we don't use that calendar today, do we? Well, as it turns out, we do. Most of the world goes by the Gregorian calendar from Pope Gregory, which was a revision of the Julian calendar. Yeah, I know, I was surprised too. I didn't know that. Wait till you hear where the months of August and July come from. Your boy Augustus and yet again Julius Caesar. Yes, the dude made a whole month for himself and just threw it in there. Okay, now hear me out. We're gonna break some stuff down here. Ready? Octa, Nova, and Deca are all prefixes for 8, 9, and 10, right? Just like October, November, and December are the 8th, 9th, and 10th months out of the year. That makes sense. Big prank though. I got you. Nice try. Because after July and August were added, the others got pushed back. It's crazy what you can do with a little power. It's crazy. So now October, November, December are 10, 11, and 12. They got pushed back. See, it's crazy. You ever wonder that? See, that's how they did it. It makes. There's some people like, I actually didn't know that. I open up your mind, brother. That's what I do. That's what I do here. Number 3. The Empire business. I'm in the Empire business. Yes, all Walter White and Saul Goodman references aside, also good show, watch it. When one thinks of empires, the Romans just come to mind. Many have come and gone, and others have had bigger and lasted longer. However, none really had the influence and power of the mighty Roman Empire stretching all over the Mediterranean, Northern Africa, even some parts of the Middle East. Senatus Populus Romanus. She was glorious. Unfortunately, this wouldn't last. Years of corruption in government, war, difficulty in controlling its empire from being too big, and just a lack of communication. It takes a long time to get messages around, and maybe the biggest religious reform led to the capital moving east, and the empire being split into east and west, and then those Byzantine guys showed up, and it got a little crazy. There's east and west, and then some Ottomans. Whoa, what happened? Yeah, it didn't last forever. Sucks. Number 2, concrete. There's something in that concrete, and this is related back to the arches I was talking about earlier. See? Told you we get there. Yep, told you. None of the gorgeous buildings Rome had ever constructed would be possible without use of their concrete. Using volcanic ash and lime mixed with a base aggregate made for a very tough and durable solid building material. You can even use this stuff underwater. Sounds like I'm giving you guys a sales pitch. It gets tougher as time goes on, and some Roman sites with buildings made of this miracle stuff have little to no wear on the material itself. That's pretty impressive. I spent countless hours awake in the late hours of the night watching dudes make Roman concrete. Am I a builder? No. Am I a tinkerer? No. Should I have been in bed? Yes. However you look at it, it's just cool stuff. There's some cool videos out there. It's really cool stuff. It lasts forever. Like the buildings are actually gone, but like the concrete itself, dude, you could use it again. It's insane. It's just, where did we go wrong? Number 1, entertainment, show business. After bread and wine comes entertainment. Okay, no, they didn't invent fun, because Romans probably had a different idea of fun than we do. All you have to do is look at the Colosseum and some of the other large sports event centers they built. Yeah, it wasn't just the Colosseum in Rome, but across the Roman Empire there was more. Why? Because they needed to be entertained. Gladiators, lions, fights, you know what was going on. There's always been actors, storytellers, but it was the Romans who made it theatrical. If you ask any acting teacher, that's what'll tell you what counts. The theatrics.
At number 10, population. It's pretty messed up just how many slaves there were in ancient Rome. In their society, wealthy people owned dozens, if not hundreds of slaves to do their menial work. In ancient Rome, anyone could be sold into slavery. No matter your race or background, if you could work, you could be bought and sold. Historians believe that about 90% of the free people in Italy by the 1st century BCE had ancestors who were slaves. At one point, the Roman Senate debated having slaves wear uniforms to be able to distinguish them from the rest of society, but they ultimately decided against it when they realized just how many slaves there were. One ancient Roman politician once said, quote, "It was once proposed in the Senate that slaves should be distinguished from free people by their dress, but then it was realized how great a danger this would be if our slaves began to count us." End quote. They literally couldn't afford to let the slaves know how many other slaves there were, because if they would have known they outnumbered the other members of society, this could have led to a revolt. I mean, there were slave revolts regardless, but we will get to that later. At number 9, lifestyle. Ancient Roman slaves experienced different lifestyles and living conditions based on a number of factors, often linked to their occupations. Slaves who didn't have a specific skill or trade were often used in mines and agriculture, and those were the harshest conditions that they could have been subjected to. Oftentimes, they were literally worked to death, and since they didn't have any human rights in the eyes of the Romans, they were often overlooked and simply replaced. On the other hand, household slaves received more humane treatment. They were treated better by their masters, and sometimes they were able to get some money in order to buy their freedom. If they were able to buy their freedom, the slaves would become freedmen, which was a social class between slaves and free people. Before we continue discussing the hard lives of slaves in ancient Rome, make sure you guys smash that thumbs up button if you're thoroughly entertained so far, and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this one. At number 8, Spartacus. At one point, a group of Roman slaves revolted, and though they eventually lost their battle, they survived a pretty long time thanks to one famous slave named Spartacus. Spartacus was a slave who escaped a gladiatorial training camp and recruited thousands of other slaves to fight for their freedom alongside him. For the slaves, Spartacus was their symbol of hope and their leader. This slave army was able to defy Roman authorities for 2 years with freedom in their sights, but unfortunately those dreams were crushed when Roman general Crassus crushed Spartacus and his army. After Spartacus was killed, the authorities came for the rest of the slaves in the army, and they were severely punished. 6,000 slaves who took part in the revolt were crucified, and this was almost a warning to the other slaves against trying to revolt again. Spartacus became a legend, but it wasn't enough to free the Roman slaves. At number 7, ownership. In ancient Rome, slavery and slave ownership was such a common practice that pretty much everyone owned slaves, regardless of social status. Even some of the poorest Roman citizens would own 1 or 2 slaves. Obviously, the more money you had back then, the more slaves you could afford. In Roman Egypt, the average artisan owned about 2 or 3 slaves each. Emperor Nero was known to have owned over 400 slaves who lived and worked in his home in the city, but his numbers are eclipsed by a wealthy Roman named Gaius Caecilius Isidorus, who according to historical records owned 4,166 slaves at the time of his death. That just gives you an idea of just how many people were sold into slavery in the first place. At number 6, freedom. Earlier I mentioned that Roman slaves had the chance to buy their freedom. It was a lengthy process, but this gave a lot of slaves hope for a better life. Things weren't always better after buying their freedom though, and many of them sold themselves back into slavery because things were tough. The process of buying your freedom as a slave was called manumission. This could be achieved in a number of ways. Slave master could grant their slave freedom as a reward for their service and loyalty. The slave could pay their master a sum of money to be freed, or sometimes a slave master could just find it convenient to let their slave go. Most slave masters who chose that last option to free their slave for their own benefit were merchants who needed someone to be able to sign contracts on their behalf, and since slaves weren't allowed to represent their masters from a legal standpoint, they would be freed, but would still work for their master. You also had to be over the age of 30 to buy your freedom, so if you were lucky to live that long, then there was hope of being freed, but with the average life expectancy in ancient Rome being about 28 years or so, and with the living conditions of many slaves, they would be lucky to get that opportunity.
It was of course used by all. Either that or you would just be naked. I found this neat step-by-step on how to make your own loincloth, and I tried it, and it's way more complicated than I could have ever imagined, okay? We don't have a lot of archaeological evidence because these linens barely made it through a decade, obviously. There's not a lot of bones in them that would hang out over these thousands of years. But ancient Romans would often use leather to make underwear. Can you imagine that? Hot goat skin wrapped around your waist in the sun? Oh, I need baby powder just thinking about it right now. We still use leather today when it comes to undergarments and, you know, zippers and stuff, but that's for another video. We'll get to that another time. Number 4, cesspools. Hey, here's a note. If you're gonna make a massive castle, you need to know where not to build certain rooms, in case you're building a castle. Anyone watching? Like say over a cesspool, as an example. Yeah, don't build anything heavy over here, or else let's talk about it. Cesspools were often placed under floors, which makes sense because, you know, gravity and life and stuff. But you need to make sure those floors are supportive enough, period. That's it. Or else, this will happen. Back in 1183, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire had a dinner in the palace of Erfurt. But in the main floor of the main hall broke open, resulting in a bunch of dinner guests falling through said floor, with even a few drowning again in said cesspool. Yeah, it's a horrible way to go. And then again, in 1326 in England, Richard the Raker had just sat down. The guy hasn't even started his meal yet, and then again the floor beneath him broke and he fell through and drowned in a cesspool. That's like the worst way to drown too. I'd say chamber pots were safer, but when it comes to waste, out of sight, out of mind. Sadly, just get that shit away from me. Just downhill, Get it out, or else we'll drown in it, probably. Number 3, Roman shampoo. Okay, when my hair grew out over the pandemic, I had a panic attack. I didn't know what the f to do. I had a huge wake-up call. I've never had long hair before. I didn't know what to use in this mop. I still don't. Clearly, evidently, all I had growing up was the classic 4-in-1 shampoo for guys. That wasn't working out at all. That sucked. I needed some curl cream, okay? Separate jars of items, not just a 5-in-1 with mouthwash on your head. Those aren't good. Those don't do anyone any good. But the ancient Romans, they didn't have Head and Shoulders back then. What did they do? Well, sometimes nothing. They would dip their hair in cold water, and at public bathhouses also, very public, then they would rub and scrape away oils. Lime water was also used to wash your hair, but that was just as useful as lime wire. Sometimes Europeans wouldn't even use water at all to clean their head. They would rub their head with bran, like just a loose bran, before bed, and then they'd brush it out with a comb in the morning. Yeah, bran. I used dog shampoo once by accident. I thought that was bad. Bran? Be so itchy, I wouldn't sleep a wink. Number 2, ancient socks. Somebody got me socks over the holidays as a gift, and let me tell you, last year, I became a man. I was like, thank you, I actually love this. This is now the best gift of my life. Socks and lip balm, that's it. I don't want a PlayStation, get lost. Socks in ancient Greece, first of all, they weren't, the ankle socks. There weren't Vans skateboarding socks. There weren't the weird grippy ones that kids have. Where were those growing up, first of all? Not even close. Socks came around in the 8th century BC, and it was made fresh from animal hairs. This led to Romans tying animal skins around their feet, and then, tying it more and more and more and higher. Anything to keep it there. Now cut to the 2nd century AD in ancient Rome, the sock game finally got real. Romans began using fabrics instead of animal skins. It was now softer, it was lighter, and then later in the 5th century, socks were worn only by the most holy, which is kind of ironic because socks have holes in them. You get the joke, there it is. Socks were associated with the church. They were considered a symbol of purity. Socks would go all the way up your leg back then. Like I said, a little different than the New Balance ankle socks we got today. A little less holy. Finally, number 1, public bathhouse. This last one, okay, we haven't moved on from this at all. That's why I wanted to finish this list. Nice little fresh, fun reminder from Taylor McWaters. Here we go. We still bathe together, a lot. We go to water parks and we swim around in pools filled with pee. Ancient Roman bathhouses were the older, slightly yuckier versions of water parks. They would literally spread intestinal parasites. They were actually way worse. In these massive rooms with giant pools just lie disease, nude, there were and everyone was sweaty and it was all tight and there was no filtration system. It was like an indoor hot tub without the pumps or the salts. It was gross. The Romans were literally figuring out sewage systems at the same time, which I of course mentioned earlier, but they were also the first to create heated public baths. Yeah, my above ground pool wasn't heated, but the ancient Romans, they had heated pools. Great, I just sent an email to my dad this afternoon, now I'm pissed. The Archaeology and Anthropology department at Cambridge discovered that Romans brought lots of parasites to Europe. Yeah, the fossilized feces showed that these heated, relaxing, rejuvenating bathhouses nearby were all but. Yeah, they were horrible. They were just spreading hot disease, coming in hot. I don't mean to undermine the ancient Romans. To be fair, they also brought with them lice and fleas. Ayo, this one for the road.
To us. Let's start with not consummating our marriage. In the Roman Republic, there was a custom saying that if the bride was a virgin, her husband should only sleep beside her or holding her without having intercourse for at least the first night of the marriage. The aim was to give the woman a chance to get used to the new situation, especially since marriage occurred young, and I cannot emphasize this enough, but women were raised to be very, very, very good mothers and housekeepers, but they were never actually raised to be lovers or partners. It's why so many societies in history we've seen abundance of brothels and working girls and a widespread acceptance of men seeking out infidelity. Their partners couldn't suit their needs because they didn't know how, but women without the job of being their wives could. Unfortunately, this very sweet just cuddle first night practice degenerated over time. Some men forced themselves on their wives. The custom disappeared thanks to the male ego, and everybody agreed on the whole intercourse during the first wedding night thing. So a newfound tradition took root. Before the consummation, maybe a day or so before the wedding or the day of, a Roman woman would have to go through the process of deflowering. In order to do that, she was taken to the Montanus Tutanus temple on Vielia, where she would sit on the rod of Montanus Tutanus, the marriage deity. Anyways, after sitting on it, she doesn't have to do anything more than that if she does not want to. The bride-to-be was successfully deflowered, and she was able to go have intercourse with her husband later. This strange custom supposedly derived from the Romans' belief that the first penetration, being with the deity, would guarantee fertility and healthy children. Next up is a poisonous cocktail. It was named after the maker of the poison, Mithridates the Great, whose father had been smoked by poisoned food at a banquet. Between that that and the plots his mom and bro devised against him, Mithridates began a long process of gradually administering himself incrementally larger doses of all the poisons, toxins, and venoms he could find, in hopes of slowly building up his immunity against them. The blend was known as Mithridatium. Seeing as he lived into his 80s, homeboy may have been onto something, and it seems that other Roman leaders agree with me with that. The story goes that assuming that he was now invulnerable to all threats, the young king became belligerent and power drunk, and in 88 BC launched an ultimately flawed campaign against the entirety of the Roman Empire, and it turned into a war that lasted 25 years. Mithridates eventually loses and flees to the Armenian countryside with one of his guards. Knowing that if the Romans found him alive, his kingdom would fall, Mithridates reportedly attempts to poison himself, but he's immune. Instead, he's forced to demand his guards stab him to death. In an attempt to ensure that he could not be killed by poison, Mithridates had apparently guaranteed himself a bloody and violent death instead. Naturally, Roman emperors got a hold of this poison mix and followed suit in his path. But that's not all they're willing to consume. Next is piss for everything. Where we see a porta potty, the Romans see dollar signs. In Rome, most of the citizenry's sewage ended up in the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest sewage systems. From here, urine was collected and thanks to its ammonia content was sold as a chemical used in laundry and tanning leather. Outside of Rome itself, full-ons, Roman dry cleaners, would visit the toilets and collect urine as well. Pause. How did they separate the urine from the feces? Was there certain toilets for certain ones and pipes that kept them separate? Or was it all one chute and they strained out the solid matter? In which case that would be a lot more than just pee in that liquid. But let's not go down that rabbit hole that I don't want to think about. Urine became such a big business that Emperor Vespasian, who ruled from 69 to 79 AD, began taxing it. When his son Titus complained of the disgusting way his father was making coin, Vespasian told his son to smell a gold coin. Then he asked him if it stank. When his son replied that it didn't, the emperor replied, "Yet it comes from urine." Oh, call that dirty money? You just got owned, son. Even Emperor Nero passed the urine tax, which everyone had to pay if they want to use a public bathroom. So what else are they using it for? Mouthwash for whitening your teeth, growing juicy fruits like pomegranates and citrus, washing their togas, curing diseased animals, fertilizing lands, tanning leather, or their own skin. No shortage of piss potential in Rome. And speaking of bathrooms, the ancient Romans took explosive diarrhea to a whole new level with blowing up the bowl. Almost every city in ancient Rome had large public latrines, let alone any of average size or small size. In the Forum of Julius Caesar, for example, archaeologists discovered a latrine with 50 toilets. Like other latrines in ancient Rome, Caesar's had heated floors. In general, many had marble paneling, mosaics on the floor, and even decorative statues. Yet when you enter a Roman toilet, this social and cultural hub of conversation and laughter and strained faces, there was a very real risk you would die. The first problem was creatures living in the sewage system: snakes, scorpions, octopuses, and clawing rats, which would claw up and just bite or whack people on the ass while they did their business. Worse than that though, unlike today where we flush and walk away, they had to fear the methane buildup, which sometimes got so bad that it would ignite and explode under you. Sitting and doing your thing one moment turned to paste obliterated against a stone wall the next. Toilets became so dangerous that people resorted to magic to stay alive. Written spells meant to keep toilet demons at bay were found on the walls of bathrooms. Some, though, came pre-equipped with statues of Fortuna, the goddess of luck, to guard them. And many of these good luck charms were the Ficinius. Pant snake, elusive sausage, a Jimmy, a Peter, you get my point. These bad boys, big, small, uncut, or cut, were seen everywhere. Hung in doorways, made into sun catchers or wind chimes, candles, jewelry. Just about anywhere the Romans could slap a peewee, they did it, and they believed it to ward off evil spirits and the evil eye. Obviously, they didn't share our modern skittishness towards the male member, let alone nudity. It was fairly common to see the everyday Roman man walk around with a copper dong on his necklace, seeing as they were believed to prevent harm from coming to people who wore them. Good luck peni were also drawn on safe places to keep travelers safe. Sharp curves and rickety bridges in Rome often had dongs drawn on them to grant good luck to every passerby. The volcanic eruption that buried Pompeii left it wonderfully preserved for archaeologists, who when they got their first look at it, found things that were so obscene they hid them from the public view for over 100 years. Pompeii was filled with art that was so filthy, it was like a physicalized prehistoric Brazzers.com. To this day, you can walk through Pompeii and see a sight that Romans would have enjoyed every day. Dinglings carved into the road, with the tips sometimes emitting a droplet, pointing the way to the nearest brothel.
Number 5. blindfolded. Remember that last scene in the movie Dodgeball when Vince Vaughn blindfolds himself and then still wins somehow? What a moment in time. There were no dry eyes in the entire theater. But what if I told you gladiators would also pull this trick off? Yeah, in order to get crowds to return to these massive death events, they would need to change the formula up from time to time. Sometimes they would have cheap beer nights, which helped, but a new idea that worked was referred to as andabata, where gladiators wore blindfolds during combat. They would also leave the armor inside, yeah, sometimes just battling in sandals and cloth. And you thought Marco Polo made you anxious? They would save these events for the more brutal criminals, so people weren't just forced to, wrap up their eyes and shake their legs into an arena. It was, they were bad, so it's kind of like, it was fine, I guess.
Number 4, women fought as gladiators. This was news to me. I wouldn't do it because tiny. As we might have already established, gladiators were usually built from slaves, warriors, and sometimes even volunteers. Good for you. And apparently women were not exempt from that. Female slaves were quite frequently condemned to face their fate in the arena, though some volunteered because, there were Xena warriors. Some of the time it was as genuine contenders, while some were sent simply for the entertainment or embarrassment. Emperor Domitian, for example, loved to pit women against people with dwarfism because he thought it was funny. Neither the women or the little people were taken seriously, as few appeared to have proven themselves in combat. However, some still did, rest assured. The timeline as to when they started doing this is unclear, but there are records of at least 2 women referred to as Amazon and Achillea. Epic names, right? Whoa. They are depicted on a marble relief dating back to the 2nd century AD, and it says that they fought in an honorable draw. Women also joined in the animal hunts, but by 200 AD their participation ended when Emperor Septimus Severus banned them in the games. Damn you, Severus Snape!
Number 3, nets for weapons. When you're walking into that arena, you're eyeing down this 8'6" beast in front of you. He has like 12 abs. It doesn't look good. His name's Gore or something terrifying. You're gonna want a Nerf bat or 2. You're gonna want a weapon. Now, weapons in the Colosseum were a necessity, of course, but can you believe some gladiators would use nets to fight? Nets. Yes. Yeah, nets, like they're catching butterflies or co-hosts. This class was referred to as the Rhetari. Now their combat style was built around the ways of fishermen. Yeah, Popeye versus Maximus. Place your bets, people. Realistically, these warriors looked a lot more like Aquaman. They would fight with a trident and a net. They would take their time. They would avoid these mighty swings from these big dudes. And then when the time was right, they would just go zzz, and then they would just poke the shit out of them with a trident over and over in hopes that it would, end. It helps to be quick, but if you've seen Game of Thrones, you know that spears don't always work.
Number 2, are you not entertained? Great title, I know. Fun fact, gladiators for the most part didn't actually try and kill each other in the ring, just like wound. Yeah, take a second to digest that beside the Hollywood movies you know and love. But the truth was, gladiators had a code they had to follow, and killing each other wasn't a part of it. Why? Well, because gladiators were expensive investments, and seeing your prize fighter that you forked hundreds and thousands of dollars into die in a fight would hurt your wallet big time. Also, most of them knew each other and were besties, so they didn't even want to. Contests were usually single combat between 2 even opponents, and referees oversaw the whole thing. If one got injured enough, the ref would probably just, call it. Often enough, the bout would end after both participants gave an entertaining show and would leave with honor. They were like, yeah, you're entertained, good, we're good to go, right? Cool. However, their life expectancy was still short. Historians estimate that gladiators had 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 chance of ending up dead after the bout, either from being killed or wounded, gangrene, the whole deal.
And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, naval battles. Okay, so I mentioned the Aquaman gladiators with the nets and the, pokey poke tridents. That's absolutely insane, but have you heard about the staged naval battles? What a spectacle this would have been. The Colosseum was once flooded, which I'm sure took a hot minute or 2. Then these ships would come out, and then it would be like medieval times, but with a splash zone, right? These ships were designed to resemble these vessels from famous battles, but the bottom of the ship was flat because the water was only 5 feet deep. Can't have the bottom of the ship scraping against all that sand and bones and stuff. No, you'll get stuck. The water was only 5 feet deep, so obviously they couldn't use real ships. It wasn't always violent reenactments either. Sometimes they would fill the Colosseum and nude synchronized swimmers would come out. Nice, nothing like an in-ground pool filled with gladiator bones. Also, goggles weren't invented until the 14th century, so yuck. These naval battles were doing so well that Emperor Domitian devoted an entire lake to them. It's kind of like Harry Potter Goblet of Fire. They would just go to this lake and then watch these insane battles or performances, you know? Hashtags Slytherin, I don't know. Once the shows moved over there permanently, they then used the floodgates and trapdoors to hide animals inside of. What a nice upgrade. What a show. Also, this is terrifying.
Number 10, grid-based cities. Next time you find yourself at 2nd Avenue and East 59th Street in New York and get into a car accident or are just enjoying the pleasures of Manhattan traffic, you can thank the Romans. Also, shout out to New York. Chetty loves you. What's going on, New York? How you doing? How you doing? No, how you doing? Yes, it was the Romans who began to develop cities and Rome into a grid-like pattern. In a time before roads full of cars, this makes sense. I mean, come on, how much space and traffic can horses and carriages take up? There are benefits to building your city in a grid pattern. It's walkable, easy to navigate, and you can size up the city pretty well. I play a lot of city builders. I like those games. Those games are fun. SimCity. Trust me, I would know. This is also true so long as your city isn't packed with skyscrapers and bumper to bumper in rideshare vehicles. You kind of lose the plot when you get to a big city like that, but they started it, there it was. Number 9, arches. For the dudes who like feet, this one is not for you. Ain't those kind of arches, dude, sorry. Today I'm talking about Roman arches. Someone somewhere in Rome discovered that the shape of an arch actually makes for a very effective building. I know, who would have thought? You can tell because as soon as they were discovered, they were popping up everywhere, like pimples on prom night. Simple geometry makes complex architecture. Arches can handle their loads, even if they are overbearing. And trust me, I've seen some overbearing loads in my lifetime. Where's an arch when you need one? The arch simply is a mainstay of Roman architecture and a small part of what made up of the magnificent constructions. I'll get more to that on later. You'll see. You'll see. Number 8, sewers and sanitation. Apart from sanitation, medicine, education, wine, public order, roads, and the fresh water system, and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us? Man, I love that quote. Both historical and comical. It's kind of like, I think that's why you guys like to watch me sometimes, right? We'll try it. We'll see. Best of both worlds. Well, it's true. The Romans understood how important sanitation was. While perhaps not the first invention of such, they are the inventors of the modern use of such. The Mediterranean is gorgeous, but after a diet of fish from the sea and pasta, well, you gotta go. One of the ways Romans did this was public bathrooms, except it's more like a room where you and the whole city just do what must be done in front of one another. There's no stalls, it's kind of just lined up. It's a little gross, a little bit. So yes, the sanitation was a great thing, but going together all at once? Well, I don't have to tell you how bad that was. Especially, public washrooms, you know how they can be bad. Especially with open stalls, that just can't, no good. Number 7, roads. All roads lead to Rome. This might sound very stupid, but to us, the Roman roads did change history. Given that there's still Roman roads out there right now that have survived 2,000 years of climate and use, it's pretty impressive. And then there's our modern roads that give in after a couple bad winters in your grandfather's boat of a Buick, creating potholes every time he brakes. The roads consisted of layers of rock and dirt that made for a sturdy road. Hundreds of civilians, horses, traders, carts traveling back and forth on Roman roads every day. Imagine how hard it would be to get to the next city over with no car and no road. That's some rough traveling. Too bad we couldn't have them back or build our roads today. I've got some denarius for the next Roman to build me a road, baby. Come on over, build us a road. Number 6, aqueducts. These are honestly amazing feats of engineering. Even today, it's a lot of bricks to lay down for a little bit of water. So the question is, you build a very busy city, probably the most impressive city and cities of the ancient era. You need 2 things for all those folks, water and food. Okay, well, we can do farms outside the city walls, no problem, but water, we need people to drink water, and those farms need water too. How do you get water to a busy city center? Aqueducts. Basically, a long bridge that connects freshwater springs to the fountains in the city, essentially running water. This, for the time, was very incredible. Hundreds if not thousands of years ahead of their time. To be able to walk into town and drink fresh water was a luxury, one that Rome might have taken for granted. Now every home has running water, and it's great and we all love it. You love tap water, I love tap water. Where's my Brita? Number 5, Roman numerals. Attack of the math. Look, I don't want to give the Romans.
Number 5, bathroom hangouts. Bathroom lighting is key when you go out. Those 1 a.m. selfies never looked or felt so good. Ancient Roman times, hanging out in the bathroom with your friends was quite common, but they didn't have any neon lights or quotes and selfies. It was just a lot of bricks. Oh, and also, it smelled really bad. They didn't have the Charmin Ultra less is more lifestyle. They had to use sticks with sponges to wipe. And yeah, of course, they also had to share. Socializing in these ancient toilets was like socializing at a Starbucks. It was normal. You would spend hours here and you got done, literally. Groups of Romans would discuss business, politics, military strategies, all the while a dude's in the corner just like going to the bathroom. Romans believed the goddess Cloacina was the guardian of the toilet drain system. Cloaca Maxima translates to big drain. I guess when you invent the flushing toilet, you can call them whatever you want. Just don't call any meetings there, perhaps. Might be a good start. Number 4, no soap. Sometimes you're in a rush, it happens. You don't have time to shower, so you do the classic spray yourself with cologne and then hope that you fool the world. It's a smart move, but the ancient Romans were way ahead of you. While they didn't clean their clothes with laundry detergent, it's not shocking to hear that they also didn't use soap to wash their bodies. Instead, they rubbed perfume oil all over themselves to get rid of sweat and all that jazz, but later on, once that oil had dried up, it was then removed with a wooden wedge or a spatula-like tool called a striggle. The world's most painful loofah, sign me up. Dirt and sweat would get stuck to this oil and then subsequently just peeled off. So it did work, but it took a little more time than our usual showers nowadays, our 5-minute rushes before work. For Romans who were well off, this was a whole event. There were several assistants you could pick from all these fancy and fragrant oils. It was slow and sensual. How was anybody ever on time back then? Number 3, all the poison. There's always the one kid who's allergic to nuts on your flight. And it's horrible, now nobody gets nuts on this flight. It's tragic, really. Research shows that feeding infants peanuts or peanut products when they're around 4 to 6 months old can prevent a peanut allergy. But Roman emperors had their own way of achieving immunity. It was common for Roman kings to seek out and then consume a small amount of each known poison because they thought at the end of this grueling trial you would become immune to them all. It was a hot blend called Mithridatum, named of course after the poison's creator, Mithridates the Great. He lived until he was 80, so maybe these potions that he created might have actually worked. The world's first vaccine perhaps. Number 2, thumbs up or thumbs down. Giving somebody a thumbs up after they've done something, it feels nice. You're like, yeah. Even a sarcastic thumbs up, use those when you get cut off in traffic. In the hit film Gladiator, there's a scene where Joaquin Phoenix's character gives Russell Crowe's character a thumbs up, and in turn he lives, and then we watch cinematic redemption. In real life, ancient Romans used these thumb signs to determine a gladiator's fate in the Colosseum. It was referred to as pollice verso. It's the Latin term for a turned thumb. The crowd would vote if a gladiator should die or not, which is also insane. It's like America's Got Talent, but like insane. While it's nice to receive a thumbs up after doing something today, if you got a thumbs up or even a thumbs down, it meant your days of living have come to an end. And finally, number 1, animals in the arena. In order to spice up the classic fight and clashing swords till death action, sometimes gladiators would be put into the arena with an animal instead of another human being. Were they squirrels, maybe an opossum, or were they tigers or elephants, bears, lions, leopards, hyenas, wolves? Oh my god, they didn't win these often, did they? Animals were very expensive, so they weren't used all the time, but the organizers of the battle would go all out for the fights if they did include them. Like Logan Paul vs. Mayweather, it's a big social event. Most animals who were used in these great battles unfortunately didn't make it out alive. That's the horrible part as well. I'm a big animal lover, so much so that I'm rooting for the elephants in these fights while reading up about this. This led to another important factor down the road. People loved when animals were included, that eventually trade in exotic animals started taking place. This quickly took the hippo from the Nile and made them extinct. Now cut to today, thousands of species are going extinct. Number 10. Sacred books. The Romans paved the way for many following civilizations, okay? They invented surgical tools, they invented medicine on the battlefield, and before this era, literature took the form of a tablet or a scroll. The Romans, they created the codex. Pages stacked on top of one another, just bound pages. The reason you have homework right now to be doing instead of watching this. It's all thanks to the ancient Romans. The early codex was bound, waxed, and then it moved to animal skin. This was a big step because early Christians used this new invention to produce copies of the Bible Bible. Important pieces of history, so rightfully so, they had to be locked away from the public. Now back when King Tarquin ruled Rome, a local woman offered the Etruscan king 9 books. Now these books were ignored at first, but upon its second glance, the beat up manuscripts foretold the rise and fall of Rome. So for most of its time, these spoiler-filled manuscripts were held in the Temple of Jupiter. So if anybody wants to do National Treasure 3, I have some ideas, just saying. We could do like 9 installments. Number 9, corrupt fire department. Oh, here we go. When we think back to ancient times, it's not long before we come across an ancient blaze or some ancient wild tragedy where you're like, oh my god, how did that even happen? Something that reminds you that it wasn't always a party, okay? It was rarely a party, in fact. When we think of Julius Caesar when regarding the leadership of Rome, we often forget Marcus Crassus. He was powerful and full of bright ideas on the sidelines. Marcus ran the fire brigade. A lot of open fires, a lot of accidents happening at this time, so of course we need responders. But back then, these officials arrived on site to this blazing emergency, but before helping out, Crassus would demand the owner sells their property to him first. Yeah, watch it burn or sell it for a not so handsome price. The choice is yours. And also you have 38 seconds to decide. TikTok. Number 8, ancient drag. I'll respect a girl's night out, okay? Always. I get it. My guy friends have ruined most nights out that I've had in the city, because guys are dumbasses. That's a fact. Ancient Romans were ahead of the game with this one as well. That's why they made the festival of the good goddess women only. Yeah, statues of men weren't even allowed to partake. Statues depicting men at this festival had to be draped. Yeah, none of us were seeing anything. But then in comes Mr. Jealous, Mr. Ancient FOMO himself. Enter Publius Clodius Pulcher, okay? This man disguised himself as a flute lady, but when he didn't play the flute, and also wasn't a lady, and also nobody knew him, it was a little obvious that an intruder was present. A trial soon followed and the festival was then suspended. See, guys ruin the party, even in ancient Roman days. This dude's like, nah, I'm gonna go ruin it. Number 7, sewer goddess. I love reading about ancient gods. It's my favorite topic. The Roman god of manure and fertilizer, for example. Where was that one in Hades? That would have been helpful. I would have beat that game in 8 minutes flat with him. The god of toilets. There's one we can't forget about either. Crepitus, okay? Every day we have to thank the god of toilets, right? If you haven't today, go ahead and thank them. The Romans regarded Glossina as the goddess of the main drain. The literal main drain to the city of Rome, all this water. This goddess was Glauca Maximum, aka Big Drain. Eventually this god was affiliated with Venus, the goddess of beauty and love. Yeah, love me some big ass drains. Nice. That's a lie actually. As a kid, I was so afraid of the bathtub drain. I would pull it and then just immediately high jump out of the tub. I don't want to get sucked down like Ant-Man. Know what I mean? Number 6, death before combat. With most of these Roman gladiators, they're trained, they understand a specific style of combat, and they're paired with an opponent that's somewhat equal. And then hundreds of people go, yeah, and they bet on you and then see blood and stuff. It's horrible. But not all these gladiators are UFC fighters, okay? Not all of them are Kurt Russell and handsome. No, a great amount of these gladiators were criminals who were forced to fight each other in the name of entertainment, or they were slaves. Yeah, these prisoners of war were not really on board with fighting a lion with a dagger, believe it or not. They understood this was a one-way trip most likely, so many of them took their own lives before the combat even begun. This one story is quite haunting, but it makes total sense. Sadly, 29 prisoners, they were all set to fight these crazy animal battles in front of thousands, but they all strangled each other. They all took each other's lives with their bare hands because that was easier to them than walking into this nightmare publicly. That's horrible. The reason this was the easier choice to make, sadly, was because saying no to the combat or to the games would just lead to an even more painful public execution. So it's a lose-lose, sadly. They sucked.
Number 5, last best hope. Romulus Augustulus was the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire. History gets kind of crazy after this point. But let's be real, what's more scandalous than being the last ruler of your empire? Could he have saved it? Would the world have looked different if he did? Truth be told, not a lot of records survived his reign, so we don't really know. Perhaps it's because he didn't have much time to write things down. Or maybe because he was still a minor when he inherited the failing Roman Empire. Or really, it was because Rome's worst nightmare had come true. The barbarians at the gates had taken over Rome. The German barbarian general Odoacer took over and claimed himself to be the king of Italy, which ushered in the end of the Great Western Roman Empire. Talk about scandal. Number 4, excess, excess, excess. Emperor Elagabalus is what I think of when I think of a Roman emperor. Someone who is pampered in a time where most people don't have access to really anything easily. Eating grapes off the vine, bottles of wine, and your servants are looking fine. Alright, alright, alright. His life of decadence was also matched with the classic level of unaliving those who oppose you, or rather groups that you feel need to be persecuted. Even more scandalous than that is the question of his sexuality. Oh. While being debated by historians today, there are rumors that the decadent emperor may have been having a relationship with his male chariot driver. There's also rumors of the emperor wearing women's clothes. Very scandalous indeed, oh handsome emperor. Number 3. Senate Purge. I am the Senate, said Tiberius, knowing that he had a really cool name. While not the worst emperor on this list, he did purge the Senate in times of political unrest, just like everyone's favorite space emperor and one of my worst impressions. He wasn't a popular choice for the job, as he really only came to power through a series of misfortunes. All of this leads to a lackluster leader who, when he retired to an island off the coast of Italy, rewarded his mediocre work with some stuff to do with younger people that I just can't say on YouTube. Apparently, he became a heavy drinker and got himself involved in all kinds of vices. It is speculated that Emperor Caligula was a child on this island and may have witnessed this debauchery. It's speculated that this may have influenced his acts of sin, and honestly not sure what to call, as these guys are, I don't know what you call this, these guys are all messed up, man, I don't know, they're just crazy. Number 2, no holidays. Septimus Severus sounds like a brothel related disease in the Harry Potter universe. But actually, he was a traditional guy. He liked things Roman and wanted to keep it that way. So, when the Jewish and Christian faith made their way to Rome, he wasn't a happy guy. So he had them persecuted. The only thing saving these people from a short Roman sword was if they worshipped the emperor and the emperor gods as well. For some reason, that made him a little more forgiving. However, considering he wasn't the only emperor to feel this way, I would think again before decorating a Christmas tree or lighting a menorah in Rome. Of course, I'm only making humor of what probably was an awful time for those religious factions. We like to romanticize Rome, but she's not all perfect. Number 1, eye for an eye. Empress Irene of the Eastern Roman Empire may have been a woman, but was just as ruthless and bloodthirsty as her male counterparts. While a lot of people probably had an issue with her leading as a woman, I'd like to hope more people today have a problem with her politics and how she came to power. A little unaliving here, cozying up over there, playing the game until she got what she wanted. And there was this one time that she wasn't too happy with her son's politics, and it was likely he was going to have her power removed, so he needed to go on a timeout. She had some guards gouge his eyes out, which mortally wounded him. No big deal or anything. I guess there was no timeout corner back then. I went to Rome to the chief's palace. He bestowed upon me this wisdom after learning about Irene. That ain't it.
Number 10, 3 fights and a funeral. This first point is still up for debate, as many historians are still trying to confirm how this whole gladiator thing started, but one possible launching point for these bloody Olympics was a blood rite at funerals. They served as a kind of violent eulogy, so instead of standing up in front of the mourning families and reading, I don't know, like a haiku or a poem, they fought out their feelings. Healthy. When esteemed aristocrats died, families would hold bouts between slaves beside the grave, like right there. Front row seat for the corpse. This was to demonstrate the virtues that were demonstrated by the dead in life. This presentation of blood in battle also could have stood in for human sacrifice. As you can guess, the tradition would gather quite the crowd and eventually evolved into the epic gladiator battles we know today. Julius Caesar, for instance, organized a massive gladiator fight between hundreds of warriors to honor the death of his father. By the end of the 1st century BC, the gladiator games were state-funded and much, much larger.
Number 9, no heckling. When the Colosseum was built in 80 AD, about 50 to 80,000 fans of Roman combat, they would pour in. The energy was high. This was their only source of entertainment, really. They weren't watching The Witcher season 2 back then, so you know, they had to do this. So some fans would get so into the action that they of course would heckle. Well, just like a comedy show, they too can hear you heckle. You're throwing off their entire performance, and that's a no-go. Today, a 21-year-old usher will politely ask you to keep it down, but in Roman Colosseum days, you don't get a warning. One of Rome's more violent emperors, Domitian, was pretty die-hard when it came to the Colosseum and the games. So much so that one day, a guy in the crowd heckled a gladiator, probably talked smack about his oiled up abs, or, smile. That's always a fun one, we hear that a lot. So Domitian had him pulled from the audience to the center of the arena where a group of aggressive dogs finished him off. How terrifying is that? No heckling, ever, even now, stop.
Hey Taylor!
Yeah?
Stop! Number 8, vegetarians. So believe it or not, the diet of a gladiator was largely vegetarian, though it wasn't really like they had any choice. It was expensive to keep these fearsome warriors, and meat wasn't always easy to come by, so they had to fill in the gap with other sources. Based on the excavation of 22 gladiators, their bones revealed that their typical food was wheat, barley, and beans. How they could tell this from their bones, no idea. Science, man. There was little sign of any meat or even dairy as well. However, they did drink another kind of mysterious substance. This study was carried out by the Medical University of Vienna in Austria and the University of Bern in Switzerland. And not only did it reveal the aforementioned vegetarian diets, it also showed evidence that they consumed a health-boosting tonic made out of plant ashes. It can be compared to the way we consume magnesium tablets or vitamin C. It was believed that it helped restore gladiators after a battle. Now obviously 22 is a pretty small sample size, but hey, that's still at least that percentage, so.
Number 7, death before combat. With most of these Roman gladiators, they are trained, they understand a specific style of combat, and they're paired off with an opponent that's somewhat equal. But not all of these gladiators are UFC fighters. Not all of them are Russell Crowe, okay? A great amount of gladiators were criminals who were forced to fight each other in the name of entertainment. These prisoners of war were not really on board with fighting a lion with a dagger. They understood that this was probably a one-way trip, so many of them took their own lives before the combat even began. This one story is haunting, but it makes total sense. 29 prisoners were all set to fight these crazy animal battles in front of thousands, but they all ended up strangling each other. They took each other's lives because that was easier to them than walking into this nightmare. That's horrible. The reason this was an easier choice to make was because saying no would lead to an even more painful and still public execution.
Number 6, aphrodisiac. The fanaticism around gladiator warriors was like the fanfare around the Beatles, the Stones, and Justin Bieber, like all around, all combined. You might even argue that they were some of the very first celebrities, and that was mostly due to their sex appeal. They were sex bombs. Ooh, beefy men. Yeah. Roman women believed that even their sweat was an aphrodisiac, like Old Spice deodorant. The gladiators won massive fame and even had their own action figures, as children would make their clay dolls emanating their favorites. Their image would be placed on walls in public spaces and even endorsed products. Women wore hair jewelry dipped in gladiator blood or mixed their sweat into hair cream or cosmetics. To have a dream about one was said to foretell a fortunate marriage. There was even graffiti in Pompeii that depicted one fighter who would catch women in his nets at night, like a sexy boogeyman.
Ooh. And since it ties in so nicely, number 5 will be the fall of Rome. After the Republic eats it, Augustus can be accredited with the establishment of the Roman Empire. He successfully curb-stomped Mark Antony during the Battle of Atticum in 31 BC, and Cleo takes herself out of commission. Augustus sets up an excellent governing system and military, bringing Rome wealth, trade, and very few military defeats. The empire reached its peak when the territory stretched from the English-Scottish border to Saudi Arabia in 117 CE, with a population high of 70 million, which was 20% of the population of the world at the time. What he can't bring Rome, however, despite all the social reforms and religious control and successful conquests, is the peace they seemingly lost. The constant civil war, financial ruin, and clan invasions had demolished the kingdom's confidence, as proven by how far the barbarian clans even made it into the Roman territories, and when the city of Rome was sacked by the Goths, it led to the final fall of the empire in 476 CE. Number 4 covers the months following Caesar's death. It's the Alaskan volcano, which we now know is to blame for the unusual weather, plagues, and famines following the death of, as said, Caesar in 44 BCE. Ancient writers who survived the period described the sun's mysterious disappearance, unseasonably cold weather, short growing seasons if not completely failed crops, and widespread famine around the Mediterranean from Rome to Egypt. Throughout the empire, starvation led to disease and fueled growing civil unrest in already turbulent times. Sources document famines in northern Italy by April of 42 BCE and northern Greece of the next year. Famines are seen in Egypt, and it's tempeculate that they weaken that country, making it the perfect moment for Octavian to conquer it and solidify his hold on the nascent empire. A recent study of Greenland ice cores now suggests that the volcanic culprit is Mount Okmok in what's now Alaska, half a world away from Rome, whose smoke and smog block the sun and slow-spreading sulfur affect crops. Letters from Cicero, the Roman statesman whose death in 42 BC is considered the symbolic end of the Republic, mention cold weather around the time of the eruption, and the dated accounts show the slow travel of the volcano's toxins through the empire. Speaking of toxicity in Rome, let's do mass expulsions for number 3. These periods were known as the drastic points in ancient Roman history. Romans didn't really care for race or sexuality as long as you dressed, talked, and behaved like a Roman. That's all that was needed to be respected in their society, immigrant or otherwise. But without holding a Latin status, immigrants had very little protection. As a result, multiple times in Roman history, nobles and emperors alike decided to kick folks out, and for a variety of reasons. You're a lawyer, doctor, or a construction worker, doesn't matter how helpful you are out. Don't have a homeland to return to? Doesn't matter. Naturally, thousands would starve just outside of the kingdom's gates for that reason. However, a mass expulsion could calm angry Roman citizens looking for someone to blame during a famine, war, or plague. Generally something or anything that would cause shortages. Religions such as Judaism or Roman paganism was often a target for expulsion, as seen in 98 BCE and 177 BCE. Professions could also be targeted. Cicero writes of an expulsion of philosophers in 126 BCE. It may not be right, of course, for one who is not a citizen to exercise the rights and privileges of citizenship, and the law on this point was secured by 2 of our wisest consuls. Still, to prevent foreigners from enjoying the advances of the city is altogether contrary to the laws of humanity. In a time of famine, Suetonius talks of how Augustus expelled owned people and gladiators. Once indeed a time of great scarcity, when it was difficult to find remedy, Augustus expelled from the city the laborers that were for sale, as well as the schools of gladiators, all foreigners with the exception of physicians and teachers and a part of the household servants. And what better to follow up expulsion than something that caused one? Number 2 is the plague of 165 AD, whose victims would fall to fever and chills with diarrhea starting red that turned black within a week. During that time, black pockmarks would scab their bodies to peel off and leave deep-ditched wounds. Towards the end, people would even cough up or excrete scabs that had formed inside of them. Like some beast, a contemporary wrote, the sickness destroyed not just a few people, but rampaged across whole cities and destroyed them. Victims would suffer for 2, sometimes 3 weeks before dying or recovering by minor miracle. This was smallpox in its first form. The Romans had dealt with malaria, intestinal wasting diseases, and worms living in putrefying wounds that would refuse to heal. But smallpox was something that began as a terrifying rumor from the east, spreading through conversation that simultaneously transmitted news of the disease and the virus itself. The smallpox plague remained in Rome for a generation, finding a peak in the year 189 when it was taking as many 2,000 people per day. It decimated the aristocracy to such a degree that town councils couldn't meet, local magistrates went unfulfilled, and community organizations failed. Abandoned farms and depopulated towns dotted the countrysides from Egypt to Germany. Alrighty, last but never the least on the list, number 1 is horrific banquets. Roman history written between 211 and 233 by Dio Cass describes a hellish meal hosted by Emperor Domitian in the year 89. It was an event seemingly designed to torment its participants. The room was completely black, from the floor to the ceiling to the table. The guests, most of whom were senators, were each assigned a personalized gravestone seat. The food served was traditionally offered as sacrifices to departed spirits, and it was all also colored to be black. Every single one of the guests feared and trembled and was kept in constant expectation of having his throat cut at the next moment, writes Cassius. Domitian apparently relished in their terror, conversing only upon topics relating to death and demise. Whether or not this dinner actually happened, it falls into a subsection of very real dinner entertainment from the past, categorized by the late historian Phyllis Pray Barber as black or hell banquets, were designed to evoke funeral services at the least or afflictions of hell itself at the worst. One famous Roman account was in March of 1519, Lorenzo di Filippo Strozzi's home. It said that a few flickering candles revealed skulls, skeletons. According to one account, no one wanted to eat because it was such a terrifying scene, and when his guests couldn't take any more, apparently at least 2 cardinals vomited that day, Strozzi orchestrated the grand finale, cracking open the skull and bones to reveal they were fakes made of sugar and filled with roast pheasant and sausages. And the wedding traditions of both ancient Rome and the ones of our modern day, we need to learn about number 10, the women of Sabine. So if you haven't seen it yet, we recently released released the top 10 messed up marriage traditions in ancient Rome, and I definitely recommend giving these 2 videos a watch consecutively. As in that one, you'll learn more about the traditions and the ceremony itself. This video, more nitty-gritty, baby. So, to recap, this story first takes place when Rome was first established, like fresh off the press, just a small military settlement in 753 BCE. As a result, its entire population was men, which, don't get me wrong, Roman soldiers could work with the same way Greek ones could, but because their mommies had done all the work for them their entire lives and now they can't wash dishes or even a shirt, they sought out replacement mommies, aka wives. Where and how do you get wives when there are no women? The answer to that question was to steal any women of childbearing age from the neighboring township of Sabine. These women were ripped from their mothers and fathers and carried in large processions back to Rome, where they were forced into marriage via physicality. Their fathers, brothers, and former husbands came to wage war and win the women back, but the women of Sabine felt it was too late. Now forced into motherhood and marriage to the soldiers, the women of Sabine throw themselves in between the evil men who are now the fathers of their children and the men who they'd been stolen from, begging that bloodshed end, wanting to live neither fatherless nor widowed. So a truce is called, and Sabine and Rome united their communities. So let's do a traditional breakdown in the following part of the countdown. What traditions ended up coming from this? Number 9 will be stolen goods. So one result of Rome literally starting off as a mass theft of ladies and their autonomy, it developed a super fun mindset and tradition that the only bride of value was one that hadn't been deflowered and had been stolen from her family. This went in 2 directions. So first, marriage continued to be theft, not like steal the bride. This was like actual theft of a person and a forceful marriage. This is how it was in the early days of Rome for a few hundo years. Obviously it can't stay that way forever because people do feel love and some people want to get married in a non-effed up way, so the tradition goes the second way. That theft would be continued but as a consenting reenactment. In a consenting reenactment after the marriage ceremony, a bride would hug her father, then hold her mother, at which point the guests and the groomsmen would pull her from her mother's arms in a recreation of what happened to the Sabines, and that she should cry out in pain and weep as she was heralded along the route to her new house, even if they were faking it, just as the Sabines had. And that's when number 8 comes in, the best man. So before the theft was a reenactment and it was still the real deal stuff, the best man and or groomsmen were crucial. If a bride's family was to steal back their daughter before the consummation occurs, this man or men's purpose was to literally guard the bride and fight her family. That's why he was called a best man. He was usually whatever man the groom knew who was best at fighting. And if he didn't want to risk getting his own butt kicked, well, he better bring his groomsmen. The more, the better. According to Country Living, the presence of groomsmen and best men was also to ensure that the bride, who in many situations was literally stolen, didn't make a break for it herself. This is why the best man stands up there next to the groom and bride instead of behind the door frame with a baseball bat, waiting for his homie's new father-in-law to come break down the door. If a fight's going to break out, you need your best fighter right there ready to go, or to tackle a runaway bride. Stolen or not, once you're married, it's time for number 7, the darkened threshold. The practice of the groom carrying the bride across the threshold of their new home or bedroom doorway dates back to the forcible actions taken on the Sabines as they fought tooth and nail to escape the soldiers. When it evolved and became part of a reenactment, the brides would continue to be carried through the threshold, but with a lot more steps in the process. So after that long and dramatic reenactment procession I mentioned, and the guests and the groom whipping walnuts at her the whole time to represent leaving childish things behind, since nuts, which was its name, was a child's game in ancient Rome, the bride would then be put down outside the front door. She would oil the door's hinges with melted tallow, wolf fat, or olive oil to keep out sorcery. Then she would hang some woolen strips taken out of her elaborate hairstyle on the door as a symbol of her taking over the traditional wives' duty of weaving wool, but also to represent the scraps of material torn off of the Sabines. To go inside her new home, the groomsmen would then lift the bride over the threshold and into the house's atrium. The threshold was sacred to the goddess Vesta, so Romans believed that carrying the woman across the threshold would ensure she avoid tripping, a bad omen. This, however, is also a reference to the Sabine women being carried inside of captors' homes. Number 6, we move away from the Sabine reenactment specific traditions. It's now cuffed up. So fun fact, it was under Romans that the detailed legal requirements for engagements, weddings, and divorce were first instituted. Given that marriage in ancient Rome was something that required strict adherence to law, it may not be surprising that it was also regarded as a contract, thus a ring was necessary. Women in ancient Rome society were given 2 wedding rings, an iron one and a gold one. The iron was stylized in the early times of Rome to look like or even act as a functioning key, indicating their husbands owned them and they were a homemaker. This ring was worn at home, whilst the second was worn in public to impress people. The most common type of ring associated with Roman marriages was the fede ring, which has a design showing a pair of clasped hands or an entwined couple. Less charming is how they're representative of a contract that's comparable to a farmer buying cows. The ring would act as a receipt and passing of ownership between the father to the future husband. That's why only women wore rings, because men weren't property.
Number 5, collars. Collars were made for animals, dogs, cattle. No one likes wearing them. Well, maybe except a certain anthropomorphic community, that is. You know what I'm talking about. Sadly though, Roman slaves did wear collars, similar to dog tags in the military. It's a form of identification, and you know that said person is a slave, which in case you didn't know was super uncool. Anyone who says otherwise is just off, or if I had to take a guess, they're the same people who would choose to side with Caesar's Legion in Fallout New Vegas. You know gosh darn well that the NCR is the right choice, and or also leading the Las Vegas Strip by yourself. I mean, come on, who doesn't want to be the CEO of 3 luxurious casinos in the Mojave Wasteland? But I digress. The collars are naughty. They're bad. Don't do that. Especially the explosive ones. I don't like it. Number 4, currency. There's something that just tickles my fancy when thinking about Roman gold coins. Maybe it's my inner historian, or maybe it's because my persona is Wario. Wario likes gold. Can't blame me. However, the Roman denarius is not what we're talking about right now. I'm talking about the ancients' other favorite currency, flesh and bone. Unfortunately for the slaves of Rome, they were traded, bought, and sold like an item, or used as a currency. When you build a whole society around such a horrible thing, this just kind of makes sense. It adds up. To make bad things even worse, sometimes when Rome was expanding or the Gauls got a little too close to Rome and some borders were being exchanged, it often meant that some slaves would change hands too. And by that, I mean they were taken and put to work for another boss that was probably less nice to them since they didn't come from the same area. Boy, history sure is mean sometimes. I tell you, that history, oh boy. Number 3, the bathhouse. I didn't think this was going to be a secret to anyone, but the slaves weren't just working in the fields or putting up some arches that last longer than most marriages. No, some poor folks had the duty of polishing pearls, smoking the salami, waxing the carrot, and finger fishing for clams. I think you get my point. Yes, the oldest profession in the world. However, it wasn't exactly a profession in this case, more like it had to be done or there would be consequences. Eugh. For me, brothels might sound great on paper, but when you're laying down in the doctor's office and he's trying to scrape barnacles off your piece of deal, well, I can't say I didn't warn you. Number 2, gladiators. Guys, I actually learned something today. I know, right? Imagine little old me learning something. Gladiators, you know them, you love them. The movie is okay in my opinion. The warriors who duked it out in the Roman Colosseum weren't always brought in chains. Some were volunteers actually. Honestly, as I was writing this, I thought to myself, well, gosh darn it there, feller. If that don't sound like that's the Hunger Games. That's right, being dragged away from your family and forced to fight in blood sport. All you're missing is Donald Sutherland's buttery smooth voice. I also can't help myself in mentioning this, but probably the first battle royale ever too. So maybe it's just a part of us. Something about the last man standing that we love so much, and why I want to spend all my savings on Fortnite skins. Number 1, thumbs up, very nice. Listen, we've all seen the movie. Joaquin Phoenix is standing there looking all Roman-like and looking into the heart of Russell Crowe, knowing damn well this will probably be his last blockbuster. That's just how it goes. There, in suspense, the audience waits to see what his thumbs do to decide his fate. Well, this is true of the Roman slaves in the Colosseum, however, there's a couple things that differ from the movie. 1, being not all who went into battle perished, and 2, the thumbs down might be what you want, actually, not the thumbs up. Meaning that the thumbs up meant yes, go ahead and finish the plebeian. A thumbs down, a fist, or even waving a cloth might have meant no, spare the poor soul, have mercy. All I know is that I do not volunteer as tribute. Sorry, Prim.
You're better off without them, apparently. Number 10 in the countdown. The Christian view of women in ancient Roman society came in and, like the religion itself, quashed the pagan beliefs preceding them. Pagan times in Rome weren't a merry old good time for women, don't get me wrong, but they had more rights and respect when there was a whole pantheon of women gods whose tempers were to be revered and feared by every Roman man. But then they convert and answer to one god who was depicted as a soul man, making it, pun intended, a man's world. In the 4th century AD, the Andrew Tate of ancient Rome, St. Jerome, set the standard on how you should perceive and treat women around you. If your wife has a bad temper, or if she's stupid, or if she has a birthmark, or if she's haughty, or if she has a foul breath, you'll only learn these things after marriage. You always have to tell her how beautiful she looks. If you so much as look at another woman, she feels rejected. You have to bow down before her and call her my lady, and you mustn't forget her birthday. It's worse if she's pretty than if she's ugly, because then you have to constantly be on your guard. Honestly, try and tell me you can't picture some old Roman bald dude in a toga, like white beard, one of those stupid teak tables, wearing the oversized podcast headphones, saying that exact tirade while like Joe Rogan is sitting across from nodding like, yeah man, yeah, that's what's up. Hey dude, kinda makes sense that you're only gonna find out about her personality after you married her, when y'all don't even know each other when you get married and you bought her at a bride auction like she's a cow for your farm. So, according to St. Jerome, it was better to be alone with God than in the company of a woman. Guess God is a woman, because he was found in bed having an affair with a married one. Oopsies, hypocrite. Do you want to learn more about hypocrisy in the past? Because there's a ton of it. Subscribe to The Hive to see our regularly released history videos. Alrighty, that was a beautiful segue into number 9, the discussion of how women in ancient Rome could be worshipped but never equal. As stated, while Roman society may have been dominated by men, their original godly pantheon was anything but. They bowed to powerful women, begging for mercy or pleasure from their female goddesses. Part of the appeal of Christianity was bowing to a woman no longer. They finally became obsolete, powerless. But they were anything but powerless in the era of Roman paganism. Of the 3 supreme deities worshipped by ancient Romans, only one, Jupiter, the king of gods, was male. The other 2 were Juno, the chief goddess and protectress of the empire, and Minerva, Jupiter's daughter, the goddess of wisdom and war. The Vestal Virgins, aka priestesses of Vesta, were ranked among the city's most important residents, having been appointed to this role before puberty, remaining chaste for the next 30 years of their lives. These 6 virginal women held sacred duties like preserving the hearth fire, and Vesta's temple, as it was believed if the fire died, so would Rome. That's a pretty serious job. They also had the most important duties in the kingdom, such as safeguarding the wills of the wealthiest and most prominent Romans, such as Julius Caesar himself, because women were more trustworthy than men, but they weren't to be trusted. Okay, anyway, the priestesses' religious significance gave them unusual power and influence, and they occasionally used it, as when they intervened to save the young Caesar from the dictator Sulla. This worship of women and deifying them into earthly roles such as the Vestals had been the saving grace of women's rights in the horrifically male-centric Roman society. Unfortunately, as said, it was swept away in the name of man. Okay, a break from sad lady facts. For number 8, let's cover warrior women. Yeah, now that's more like it. So, from the northernmost tip of the border with Asia, plenty of ancient European armies were happy to welcome women into their ranks. But historians always agree upon one exception where the army and navy were almost 99.9% men. Can you guess who it is from the title of the video? Women may have been banned legally from joining the army, but your average Roman soldier would have seen their fair share of female combatants, as well as their own women on the home front. Professor Valentine J. Belfiglio shared that Roman women were capable of close combat as well. Not only were they frequent competitors in gladiatorial shows, but they, like the women of the clans fighting against the invading Romans, were known to take up arms in warfare, albeit in a non-official, unsanctioned capacity. History tells of a few of these women, such as Cloelia, who in 506 BCE freed herself and 20 others from the Etruscan camp and swam them home through enemy spears. For her courage, the Romans erected a bronze equestrian statue with the heroine seated upon it. Belfiglio notes, on the highest point along the sacred way. When the Carthaginian general Hannibal was invading, women and men inhabitants fought valiantly, and they burned his siege engines together. Hannibal would later face and lose to the honored Busa, who aided Roman fugitives from his war regime. So, in summary, women may have been banned legally from joining the army, but your average Roman soldier would have battled against, and sometimes besides, women despite that. The name game! It's number 7 in the countdown, women, like a lazy boy chair. an ice maker, or owning a cat were possessions in ancient Rome. And so, like the college roommate who complained if you moved their toaster 2 inches to the left, they put their name on it. Not in a label maker fashion, more so in a recycle fashion. From the moment of their birth, women were viewed under male authority. Therefore, the name of a baby girl would be close to her father's. For example, Claudius may have a daughter named Claudia. Augustus becomes Augusta. Constantine, Constantina. Okay, so maybe the rule was just whatever the last letter was, swap it to an A. Ironically, this is why a lot of women's names end with an sound. Talk about making historical waves, seeing as our society still inherently perceives names with that ending as sounding feminine. As the empire grew older, women in the ancient Rome were granted more freedom, often by sheer number of children they bore. 3 children could allow a woman to become independent. Independence meant no more naming your kids after their dad, which isn't fair anyways because I'm sorry, but who carried this kid for 12 months and then had to push it out? Thus, daughters started being named after goddesses, their mothers, their aunts, and plants. Anyways, number 6, once you were old enough for baby time, you were married off, and when that happened, you donned a stola. In my recent video, the top 10 messed up marriage traditions in ancient Rome, I explained the Roman marriage ceremony and also the garb worn. The flammeum was an egg yolk yellow veil worn by brides that they would lift from their face and hair in preparations for vows, to instead fall down on their shoulders and biceps. This placement of the veil signifies her donning the stola. The stola was a type of long overlay. Sometimes it was in the form of a dress itself, but oftentimes it was an additional soft and light drape of material. It was worn by married and respectable women and was also associated with modesty. For those who could afford it, a stola with decorations around its neckline was available. This trim could be patterns, embroidery, beads, and motifs. When initially introduced, the stola was a preserve for the upper-class patrician women in the early Republic. But over time, the right and then the absolute expectation to wear it extended to the lower-class women. The palla, a rectangular shawl, was also worn over it as a cloak and draped over the left shoulder. Any women who were convicted of adultery or were working girls or actresses were forbidden to wear a stola in public.
At number 5, demand. In ancient Rome, there was an incredibly high demand for slaves, but since there were so many slaves in Rome, there was always work for them. Oftentimes, people sold themselves or their children into slavery in order to pay off their debts, so when it came to being bought, that came pretty easy. Other than public office, slaves were used for almost every activity in ancient Rome. The most common slave trade was mining because workers were always in demand, mostly due to the high level of danger that came with the job, and the fact that many slaves were injured or died while working in the mines, and slave masters needed to keep replacing those who could no longer work. Domestic labor and farming were also high demand jobs for slaves back then. Back then, the logic behind using slave labor for these types of jobs was that, quote, free labor should be used in unhealthy places, end quote. Basically, they believed that it was better to have a slave pass away on the job than a free person because it would impact their business less. At number 4, procurement. The way that slaves were acquired in ancient Rome was pretty messed up, I will say. Typically, slaves were acquired through 4 different ways. They would be brought in as war captives, as victims of pirate raids, by trade, or by breeding. During the early expansion of the Roman Empire, many war captives were turned into slaves. The pirates from Sicilia, located in what is now modern-day Turkey, did business with the Romans and supplied them with a lot of their slaves. The pirates would bring their slaves to the island of Delos, which back then was considered to be the international center of slave trading. The slave trade was such a big deal back then that it has been recorded that on at least one occasion, 10,000 people were traded as slaves and shipped back to Italy in one day. This was a big business opportunity for a lot of people, but of course no one ever considered the lives of the people they were buying and selling. At number 3, fugitives. As you can imagine, life as a slave in ancient Rome, or at any period of time, wasn't easy. Living conditions were poor, it was dangerous, and no one should ever be treated like that or used for free labor. Many slaves have been known to escape, and obviously the same went for those in ancient Rome. Slaves running away from their masters was a common thing back then, and to deal with it, slave owners would hire professional slave catchers to hunt down, capture, and return the escaped slave back to their owner. For slave owners who wanted to take matters into their own hands, they would advertise rewards for those who could return their slaves, or they would just try and locate their slave themselves. Some slave owners had ways of preventing their slaves from getting away, like using collars with instructions on where to return the escaped slave, much like a dog collar, which is just dehumanizing. At number 2, revolts. In Roman times, slave revolts were pretty common. There have been a number of recorded slave revolts in Roman history. I mentioned the one that was led by Spartacus, but there's another pretty famous Roman slave revolt that was led by a man named Eunice. Eunice led a revolt that happened in Sicily from 135 to 132 BCE. It is said that Eunice believed himself to be a prophet and claimed to have several mystical visions. Eunice was able to persuade a number of other slaves to follow him when he performed a trick where sparks and flames came out of his mouth. They believed that he was magical, and so they followed him to try and fight back against the Roman forces. Unfortunately, they were defeated, but the example that they set is believed to have inspired yet another slave revolt in Sicily later in 104 to 103 BCE. And finally, at number 1, totally normal. Probably the most messed up thing about life as a Roman slave was just how normal slavery was in society. I mean, the Roman people were so invested in their slaves that they continuously tried to crush their revolts, and they tried everything in their power to keep them from escaping. Even the sheer number of slaves that were in their society just shows how important slavery was to them. Back then, slavery was just an unquestioned institution. For many, it was just a normal part of life, which is actually quite frightening when you think about it. There is no recorded history of Romans ever questioning slavery in their society, and all economic, legal, and social forces in Rome at this time worked hard to try and preserve slavery as part of their society. To the ancient Romans, slaves were seen as the direct opposite of free people, which they believed was a necessary balance that they needed in their society. They never completely got rid of slavery either. Though they did try and create new rules and laws to make life as a slave more bearable, they were still bought and sold into servitude and were seen as property and lesser people. Now, before I wrap things up for today, I want you guys to leave a comment down below telling me if you would ever want to go back in time and visit ancient Rome. I'm sure there was a lot in ancient Rome that people would want to see and experience for themselves, so let me know your thoughts down in the comments.
Number 10! We're making a video about mysteries from ancient Rome, and you think I'm not gonna talk about Pompey's own Villa of Mysteries? You balkin', mate, you balkin'! The Villa of Mysteries was discovered back in 1909 after being buried at Pompeii. One of the more mysterious finds was a wall fresco that depicts what could be a play or wedding, or maybe an initiation ceremony to an ancient Roman cult known as the Cult of Dionysus. We don't really know anything about what this cult actually did. They were obviously very good at keeping things under wraps. What happens in the cult stays in the cult. Or however that saying goes, I don't really remember. No one was allowed to know what happened in their initiation, rituals, or really anything. I mean, they weren't even allowed to write it down. But if that was the case, why was someone allowed to paint it on a wall? Make it make sense, bro. Make it make sense. Number 9, family traits. I think this one is kind of really interesting. There is a village in western China where the people who all live here, meaning their families are all historically from here, have blue eyes and blonde hair. While not exactly uncommon, I guess, the sheer amount of people specifically from here that have these particular traits that are different from the black hair and dark eye color of most people in China suggests that everyone who is native to this area may actually be descended from an ancient Roman legion. I have the blood of a legionnaire flowing through these veins! That'd be so cool. In 53 BC, Marcus Crassus lost pretty badly in a fight in what is modern-day Afghanistan. It's believed that the Roman soldiers that survived traveled as mercenaries, just trying to make a few bucks, and they apparently wandered as far as this village in western China. DNA tests on the villagers of this area actually do show that they are 50% Caucasian, which is super interesting, but we don't know for sure if it was these traveling for sale legionnaires that were the cause. And maybe I'm just a silly goose, but I don't even know how we would be able to find that out with some kind of archaeological evidence. Number 8, misleading. In 2010, we discovered a coffin in the city of Gabi. A coffin made of lead. It was also, interestingly enough, in the shape of a burrito, giving it the nickname Lead Burrito. You won't be seeing me going into Chipotle to ask for that one. Yes, I'll take one lead burrito, extra deceased Roman inside, please and thank you. No. The University of Michigan, the ones who led the expedition that found the coffin, said that lead coffins like this are extremely rare. But on top of that, this one specifically is incredibly heavy, like 1,000 pounds, letting us know exactly how expensive it must have been. The mysterious part comes to play when we realize we have absolutely no clue whatsoever who the adult man inside this coffin is. We know he was around at the time of Nero, but there is no evidence inside this burrito about the life this man lived. No extra toppings in this burrito, just lead and meat. Yum. Number 7, the 9th Legion. In ancient Rome, there was a legion that was known to be the best of the best the Romans had to offer. It was known as the 9th Legion. Being the best of the best came with being put into the harshest of areas to fix Rome's problems. So these boys in red were sent to England past Hadrian's Wall, where they would fight against the Picts. But then, they were just never heard from again, ever. Now, the obvious answer here is that they got absolutely demolished by the Picts. The last thing we heard was from the year 108, and we know that the legion had a pretty brutal surprise attack in Caledonia due to some Roman guards falling asleep on the job, which doesn't really seem like best of the best behavior now, does it? What makes this whole thing really weird is that in 121, there are some bricks that have the seal of the 9th Legion on them, which is about 13 years after their last mention. And on top of that, there is an officer from that legion who shows up as the governor of Arabia in 142. I think these could have just been survivors who were taken out of England after the best of the best went bust. But who knows? Not me. Number 6. Locusta the Poisoner. Nero, you little rascal you. Emperor Nero was known as one of the worst of the worst, and he was also known for having a few people, be lifed. What better way to do that than with poison? The chemist Locusta was the one who became his poison expert, but she's also kind of unfairly known as the world's first serial de-lifer because of that. Kind of unfairly because it could be completely true. We just have no idea. We know from historians at the time that Nero and even his mother liked Locusta so much that he actually helped set her up with a school dedicated to creating new poisons and all kinds of research surrounding poison. But we don't actually have any of that research. There is no proof of any of it. But she was executed by the guy who took on Nero's job after he was gone, and I can't help but think there is a decent reason for that. Maybe because of all the people she poisoned and helped poison? We will never know. Probably. I mean, we could. I don't know.
In ancient Rome, it wasn't your everyday Italian cuisine, it was more like boiled bird and brains. When one thinks of Italian food, we usually already aren't thinking correctly. Pizza was never made by them, the pasta most of us eat is totally incorrectly made, and we're drinking cappuccino wrong. But you definitely wouldn't guess things like fried dormice, or flamingo, peacock, and nightingale tongues, lamb brain, sow's womb, and more. For flamingo and parrot in foniocotero, a dish I can't pronounce, you would scald the flamingo, wash it and dress it, put it in a pot, add water, salt, dill, and a little vinegar to be parboiled. Finish cooking with a bunch of leeks and coriander and add some reduced must to give it color. No idea what that is. In the mortar, crush pepper, cumin, coriander, laser root, mint, rue, moisten with vinegar, add date, and the fond of braised bird. Thicken, strain over, and cover the bird with the sauce and serve. Parrot is prepared in the same manner. Anything toddlers or grown North Americans would dislike from an animal was the favorite of the Romans. Many ancient Roman dishes are now famous in other countries, such as haggis, the national dish of Scotland, and foie gras, which the French have perfected. That's because the Roman Empire was vast, and when they conquered other countries, they brought snacks. Fun fact, if you had dinner and were an invited guest and brought along somebody who wasn't necessarily invited, this person was called a shadow, or a parasite, and would sit at your foot the whole meal. They were expected to bring witty banter and conversation to help compensate for their free meal. On the topic of weird eats, how about a celebrity diet? Gladiators, godly men of battle arena who were revered in the heat and ignored in the streets. But no matter how lowly the status, something about that battler's blood was desirable. Several Roman authors report people gathering the blood of dead gladiators and selling it as medicine. Strangely, some Roman physicians actually report that this treatment worked. They claim to have seen people who drank human blood recover from their epileptic fits, and that was just the civilized approach. Others would pull out the gladiators' livers and eat them raw right there in the arena after he dropped. When gladiator combat was outlawed in 400 AD, people kept the treatment going by drinking the blood of decapitated prisoners. So while the gladiators who lost became medicine for epileptics, the winners became aphrodisiac. In Roman times, soap was hard to come by, so athletes cleaned themselves by covering their bodies in oil and scraping the dead skin cells off with a tool called strigil. I'll teach you more about that. Usually the dead skin cells were just discarded, but not if you're a gladiator. Their skin and sweat scrapings were often put in a bottle and sold. Often this was worked into facial creams that women would then rub all over themselves, hoping the dead skin cells of a gladiator would make them irresistible to men. And there's no way I wasn't going to talk about it on its own, scraping off the layers. The grooming habits of ancient Romans were a strange mix of activities that we might recognize from our modern lives, and routines that are completely foreign to us. For example, this tool called a strigil, which resembles more of a horse horse's hoof, pick, then a human grooming tool, was used by the Romans and the Greeks of ancient world to scrape sweat and dirt from the body. People who engaged in strenuous physical activity were prone to accumulating large amounts of sweat and dirt, and were most likely to have this item in their possession. And it was most likely to be used to clean the skin before bathing, so as to not muck up the water more than necessary. Some would lather up in olive oil to help the scraping process. If you're no gladiator, that olive oil isn't going to be funneled back into a jar to sell, but rather for someone else to lather up in and use to scrape later. Ha, public bathhouse luxury. Next up are the burial clubs, because death was an integral part of life for the Romans. Why not make a club, cult, whatever for this too, like they did for literally everything else? From the creation of Rome until about mid-2nd century AD, cremation was the most common burial rite, after which the preferred method was actual ground burials. Shockingly, having your body baked was cheaper than a fancy box in the ground, so when cremation went out of style, Rome's poorest were often tossed into pits called puticuli, meaning to rot or decompose. These pits held a mixture of human remains, animal corpses, garbage, and excrement. Some of them were large, containing 24,000 corpses each, and they'd be left open until full enough. This wasn't the best way to be buried, so anyone who could afford it would join a burial club. A burial club was a group that charged monthly dues of 100 sequestries and a jar of wine for new members. And when one of the members died, you would all pool the club's money together to bury that member. Some of these clubs had mixed membership of serfs, unfreed, and freed people. If someone took their own life, however, it was considered a forfeit right to a funeral. In addition to burying any dead members, the other main activity of the club was to hold a series of feasts every other month to honor their dead. Some of the dues were used to fund those feasts, and each one, several members, were responsible for providing a certain minimum amount of food for the sad potluck. Imagine that. Thea, I know you're still mourning Patroclus, but don't forget it's your week to bring in potluck figs and olive salad. Seriously. And of course, what completes a funeral more than a weirdly perfect replica of the dead person's face staring at you? It's death mask. The Romans celebrated the life and accomplishments of prominent men with marble busts, dedications of buildings, and grand tombs. One rather obscure crafted memorial overlooked because the artifacts have not withstood the test of time are Roman death masks, or as they're commonly referred to in Latin, imagines. Made of wax, they were unquestionably created when the man was in between 35 and 40, and that's when he had attained political office or ADL of city clerk. The new mask would join the older ones in the atrium cover, where it would remain for display until that person's death. The date at which the masks were first introduced is difficult to determine, but they were already well established by the 2nd century BC, and they continued to be used into the 4th and perhaps as late as the 6th. The masks were then kept in the family throughout the generations and often displayed in the main halls of the house. At a funeral procession, the masks of the ancestors were worn by current family members as a way of preserving their memory. Polybius describes the funeral of an illustrious man and the role of his imagines. When any distinguished member of the family dies, they take the death mask to the funeral, putting them on men who seem to bear the closest resemblance to the original in stature and carriage. Penn Museum worked with 4 graduates and a career sculptor to recreate these masks, as you can see on screen. The group used only the tools and materials accessible to those in ancient Rome, and the mask came out really well. So quite literally, like the opening scene in the campy Paris 2004's House of Wax, the Romans were making wax faces.
Kicking off the list at number 10, party hard. The term boot and rally was added to the Urban Dictionary in 2002, but Romans were riding that wave out a long time ago. They knew how to get down. Well, rather, they knew how to get it up. Ancient Romans would often make themselves puke in order to continue eating and drinking. How gross is that? What would normally be a red flag at a house party was actually a sign of respect back then. But it was business. These parties, these long, exhausting banquets, attending these was a sign of social standing. So you wanted to be around the longest. You wanted to drink the most, dance the most, and, grossly enough, puke the most. Those are the coolest Romans in town, apparently. It was so normal that you would excuse yourself from dinner and be like, excuse me, go to the vomitorium, great name, right across from the dining room. I'm sure it's a great breeze rolling through there. But then you'd go in this room, grab a feather, and then tickle thy throat, and then make room for even more lobster. What a treat. Birthday parties were never so disgusting. Number 9, gladiator blood. When Charlie Sheen started talking about drinking dragon blood, everybody looked at him like he was insane, rightfully so, but back then if you boasted about drinking gladiator blood, well, you were on the right track. Ancient Romans believed that gladiators had the literal heart of a lion, and to be fair, they were in immaculate shape. With all that long hair as well, I don't blame them. So the thought process here, being extremely superstitious, was that if you drank gladiator blood, whatever disease you had, it would soon be cured. So these Roman physicians would tell their patients with epilepsy to chug some warrior blood, like you're a vampire. Apparently it worked, like some of the time. Never really, not really. I wouldn't recommend this, don't do this. Number 8, you're in trouble. Recently, we did a list on dark medical practices used in history, and in that list we talked briefly about how urine was used by ancient Romans to whiten their smile. Lovely. Fresh breath guaranteed. Well, to dive deeper into this gross fact, Romans also used urine to wash their clothes. So after they were done washing up, they would mask the smell, or at least try to, with fragrant leaves. They would use bay leaves and just rub it all over themselves, which is interesting. They didn't use soap because the amount of ammonia used in urine, well, it did the trick. Lye was also used to clean clothes at this time, but it was too pricey. So plan B was to head down to the Fullones, the ancient laundromat, where everybody would just catch up and stomp on their, urine-filled clothes. Again, the smell is probably not that pleasant. Number 7, Roman art. If you've seen Superbad recently, this next one will ring a bell. I grew up watching Art Attack, okay? The British dude, Neil Butchanan, with his aggressive sidekick head that would just yell at you all day. What a fun way to learn how to draw. Well, back in the 18th century, when excavations took place in the city of Pompeii, they found lots and lots of art with a similar eggplant theme. I'm trying not to say what I really want to say here, people. Genitals carved everywhere. Carved, I said, not just like, drawn in Sharpie. Carved in the streets, carved in the walls. Just under a street sign, you'll see one of these. Just popping out at you. Hello. Just generations of genitals. Rich history, folks. The phalluses of Pompeii. Imagine tripping over one of these. You do that thing where you look back to see what you almost rolled your ankle on. Imagine looking back and seeing that in the ground. I'd be like, okay, we're just gonna keep walking. Many tour guides like to say that they all point and lead to a brothel, when in reality these were actually just for good luck. They didn't really have a purpose other than good fortune. These symbols were to ward off the evil eye. Most folk kept these outside their front homes, right next to the mailbox. That's great, it's a good spot to put it. Number 6, new hair, new me. Glowing up these days is quite easy. Change your hair color up, throw on some jorts, listen to Adele's new album, Bob's Your Uncle. It works. It always works. But if you were an ancient Roman and you want to show off the new you to your ex, maybe at the vomitorium party, how would you change your hair? How would you do it? Well, it was common, but the way they used to get it done was all but. Romans would have to use goat fat and beechwood ashes to bring out those highlights. Maybe it's goat fat, maybe it's Maybelline. Again, like those crazy parties, this was a symbol of status. If your hair didn't reek of goat fat, who even are you? Get out of here. Emperor Claudius III, his wife Valeria, apparently she once dyed her hair blonde and then painted her entire body gold and then had a contest to see who could hook up with the most Romans in one night. I feel like this would have been a really good reality TV show back in the day. Number 5, no soap. Look, sometimes you're in a rush, you don't have time to shower, so you do the classic Axe body spray X, The old 1-2. Do you remember that, Chris? Oh yeah. It was so cold too on the armpits. Yeah, no wonder I can't grow armpit hair. I've been spraying like aerosol, I've been spraying spray paint on my armpits every morning since I was like 9. I still use it sometimes. Axe chocolate, no contest, so good. Ancient Romans, they were way ahead of the game. They didn't clean their clothes with laundry detergent like I mentioned earlier. It's not shocking to hear that they also didn't use soap to wash their bodies. No, instead, they rubbed perfume oil all over themselves to get rid of sweat and all that jazz. But later on, once said oil had dried up, they then removed it with a wooden wedge or spatula, a tool called a strigil, and they just peel it off. I kind of like that idea. Whenever I burn in the summer, I'm like, ooh, let me peel this neck slowly. It's the world's most painful loofah, essentially. Dirt and sweat would get stuck to this oil and then subsequently peeled off. So it worked, but it took a little more time than our showers nowadays. For Romans who were well off, this of course was a whole event. There were several, assistants. You could pick all these fancy fragrant oils. It was slow and sensual. It was like fun, dare I say. How is anybody ever on time? Like, oh, sorry, I was late. Those oil baths had to stick around for 4 hours this morning and get peeled. It's crazy. Number 4, Roman art. This one reminds me of Superbad a lot, and you'll understand why. Back in the 18th century, when excavations took place in the city of Pompeii, they found lots and lots of art, all with a similar theme. Everything looked like a certain body part. An eggplant-ish theme. There were carvings in the streets, there were carvings of these things in the walls, under a street sign, you name it. They're just everywhere. Just rich history carved in all over. We're still finding these today. They're called the phalluses of Pompeii. Yeah, imagine tripping over one of these. Then you do that thing where you look back to see what you almost rolled your ankle on. You look back and see that, you're like, oh, what? Some dude in Pompeii got you like thousands of years ago. Just chiseling out a... Many tour guides like to say that they all point and lead to a brothel, when in reality, that's a lie. These were all just for good luck. These symbols were to ward off the evil eye. Most folks kept these outside the front of their homes, right next to the mailbox. Coming with mail, you're like... Number 3, animals in the Colosseum. In order to spice up the classic fight and clash swords till someone's not alive anymore, sometimes gladiators would be put in the arena with an animal instead of another human being. To, you know, spice it up, just to spice up those Saturday night shows, I guess. People are crazy. Were they squirrels? Or were they tigers, elephants, bears, leopards, lions, hyenas, or wolves? The latter. It was all the scary big animals. Animals were very expensive, so they weren't used every day, but the organizers of these battles would go all out for the fights that did include them. Everyone would pile in. It's kind of like Logan Paul versus Mayweather, you know, these big social events. We're like, well, what else are we doing, you know? Let's go watch. Most animals that were used in these great battles unfortunately didn't make it out alive. That's the horrible part. I'm a big animal lover, so that's hard to read. This led to other important factors down the road. People loved when animals were included, that eventually trade in exotic animals took place. That's where it all started. This quickly took the hippo from the Nile, for example, and then made them extinct. That's how they did that. Cut to today, thousands of species are going extinct more and more. You know what, let's just bring gladiators back, let's just do it. UFC, put them in armor, let's see what happens. That'd be hilarious. Release all the animals from zoos and then bring back just gladiators. Life will be fixed. Number 2, naval battles. Have you ever heard about staged naval battles in the Colosseum? It's a weird spectacle, but it wouldn't have been that crazy. It sounds a lot bigger and more lavish than it really was. The Colosseum was flooded at this point, which I'm sure took a hot minute, and then these ships would come out, and then it would be like medieval times almost, but with a splash zone. A really dirty splash zone. These ships were designed to resemble vessels from famous battles before, but the bottom of the ship was flat, right? These were fake boats, obviously. The water was only 5 feet deep, so obviously they couldn't use, you know, real ships or anything like that. It was all show. It wasn't always violent reenactments either though, as funny as that sounds when you think of the Roman Colosseum. Sometimes they would fill the Colosseum and have nude, synchronized swimmers as a show. Imagine that, imagine traveling the land and then you get there, you're like, oh, let's watch some action, and it's just like ballet, and they're like, oh, this is actually quite nice, I like this a lot. Yeah, also goggles weren't invented until the 14th century, so they had to swim underwater like, ugh, this is so gross, their poor eyes. These naval stories were doing so well that Emperor Domitian devoted an entire lake to them now, like the Goblet of Fire. People would walk to a lake to watch these insane shows. Only once the shows moved over there permanently, they then used the Colosseum's old floodgates to hide those animals in. So it was, you know, we love upgrades, I guess. It sucks. It's all bad. And finally, number 1, audience troubles. Okay, what's it like watching these ancient Colosseum shows? Was it fun? Was it horrifying to watch? Were you... like, the PTSD from these shows alone. When the Colosseum was built in 80 AD, about 50 to 80,000 fans of Roman combat would pour in often. The energy is high. This was their only entertainment. They weren't watching The Witcher Season 3, you know what I mean? Some fans would get so into the action that they of course would heckle, like we do nowadays with like UFC. People would be watching like, oh, throw the right hook, throw this thing. They would obviously do the same. But in Roman Colosseum days, you didn't get a warning if you heckled, you know what I mean? One of Rome's more violent emperors, Domitian, who I mentioned earlier, he was pretty diehard about the Colosseum and their games. So much so that one day, a guy in the crowd was heckling a gladiator so much, he was probably, you know, talking smack about his oiled up abs or something like that. So Emperor Domitian had him pulled from the audience to the center of the arena. And then he had to fight to survive. He didn't get out alive, obviously. It was all bad. So yeah, don't huckle. Don't huckle? Don't huckle or heckle. Don't huckle or heckle or heckle. How terrifying is that? Can you imagine heckling and then getting called out? Ancient Colosseum times. Hey Maximus, smile.
Number 10, the blade, the wife, and the horse? If you love something, you gotta let it go. Or how about parading your naked wife in front of your friends in the mighty Roman military? Emperor Caligula was so impressed with his wife's beauty, he just thought he had to share it. even though apparently she wasn't that attractive, and already had children with another man. Scandalous. If she had wheels, she'd be the town bike, if you know what I'm saying. As if displaying your wife's gratuitous curves isn't scandalous enough, apparently he would use very real threats as a strange way of flirting. Clearly this was a dude who's got some issues. Like for example, the one time he wanted to humiliate the Roman Senate by claiming to make his horse a consul. Although he didn't actually go through with it. Still though, this one's all 6s and 9s, innit? This may have been related to a brothel caught disease. He might have had syphilis, I'm just saying. Number 9, no grain. Maximus Thrax was like most Roman emperors. Seized power when he wanted, seized land when he wanted, pretty much did whatever he wanted. Strangely enough, however, he cut subsidies for grain. This was one of the many tactics to help up cover for increased taxes. Taxes that were imposed because he had doubled the pay of the military during constant military action. That's a lot of coins needed. Eventually the people had had enough. And ironically, his own guards poked him with spears until he couldn't be poked anymore. I'm not a military expert or anything, but if you're gonna wage war, you gotta have the money for it. It's kind of like when the ice cream truck comes around and you're counting quarters for a large chocolate cone because you're 12 and life is hard and you deserve it. I love the ice cream truck. Number 8, Red Roman. Emperor Caracalla was also like many other Roman emperors, as he was quite bloodthirsty and honestly just a bad dude. He unalived his brother Geta just because he didn't like him. Good reason, I guess. Then 20,000 of his brother's followers persecuted and killed. When some good folks heard about this terrible news, and were horrified, rightfully so, I mean who wouldn't be, they too were dealt with in a non-YouTube conduct safe way. He depleted the treasury from war and let foreigners have Roman citizenship. Now I know that sounds like a good thing, but it isn't. In already trying times, it completely messed up Roman societal culture. In a sense, fire is good. It allows us many things. But Caracalla threw a whole jerry can of gasoline on the fire by doing that. When your society is built on one thing, perhaps it's a good idea to not totally flip that upside down overnight, as quick decisions like that lead to quick downfalls. Just saying though, just saying. Number 7, the light of my life. Emperor Nero was straight up just not a cool guy. This whole list could be about him, but I'm here to make you laugh, not horrify you with the horrors of Pax Romana. Nero, like most emperors, was very wealthy, the kind of wealth that only people who shop at Whole Foods can understand. As it turns out, there was a fire in Rome at the time, burned for a long time, pretty big deal. Who started the fire? No one really knows, even though Nero himself might be a suspect. However, it would be really easy to get rid of a group of people you don't like if you blame it on them. So it was blamed on the hot new religion at the time, you gotta love them, Christians, except Nero didn't, and he was kind of egotistical, so in order to punish the scapegoated Christians, he had them set ablaze. So there was more light in his garden, so to speak, or that's what is said, at least. I know sometimes we can all disagree with our faith, but lighting each other on fire is not the answer. Mom always said if you have nothing nice to say, then don't light people on fire. Okay, Mom. Number 6, not so Hercules. Commodus was like many other emperors in thinking that he was very close to the gods, but Commodus thought he was a Greek god, and reincarnated Hercules to be exact. So much so that he would often take up a role as a gladiator, which a lot of Romans thought was scandalous as a leader. A leader shouldn't be dealing with the barbarians at our gates and other lands that were persecuting and invading and taking over, rather than performing in blood sports. It was thought that this was below the office of the emperor. Rumors began to stir that because of his love for the arena, he may not be the royal bloodline claimed to be. When in the arena, his adversaries always surrendered, so he always won. In return, he wouldn't kill them, to be fair, just scarred them, as it was seen to be a good thing to be bested by the emperor and then to leave with a mark. Sure, we'll go with that. Apparently, they also brought animals in for him to slaughter in the arena for entertainment. Eventually, people had enough of him wasting time and money playing gladiator games, and he was strangled by his coach. Oh, hey coach, I'm ready for the next match. How you doing? Hey, why are you looking at me like that, man? What's wrong? And what's that robe for?
Number 5, basket of bees. Guess what this one is? It's pretty much, that's exactly what it is. It's horrible. We often look at ancient Rome as the birthplace for numerals, modern plumbing, social life, all that good stuff. Don't get it twisted, ancient Rome had a lot in common with the Dark Ages as well, okay? The punishments that they would inflict on others, horribly creative, I'll say that. Like, for example, a basket of bees. A basket of bees. There we go. Maybe wasps. Who knows? I don't know. History gets all crazy, you know? This punishment saw the victim placed in a large woven basket, naked, might I add. Then the basket was hoisted up near a beehive, of course, and then Romans would just anger the hive. They would just shake the basket. And then in turn, all these bees would sting said victim to death. This was meant to be a long and painful death, but eventually, this is how humans realized folks were allergic to bees, because they would meet their demise a little too fast, you know? Romans would be like, what happened? What's going on? Are we going home now? That's it?
Number 4, the Colosseum. They say Rome wasn't built in a day, right? Right? No, I'm asking you, I don't know, that's a saying, I think I've heard that somewhere. The word Colosseum is a Latin noun formed from the word colossus, meaning gigantic. And it's huge! It once held more than 50,000 people at one time or another. That's literally the Yankee Stadium. This oval stadium was built from cement, limestone, and volcanic rock. Yeah, that thing ain't going anywhere. Historians and archaeologists are still discovering and unearthing secrets of this site. In fact, most of Rome still hasn't even been dug up yet. What? That's right. In fact, only about a tenth lays discovered, with the other 90% still somewhere around 30 feet below street level. Who knows how many wonders of the world lay unearthed. The Colosseum, also known as the seventh wonder of the world, lays megalithic, 615 feet above the ground at the center or heart of the city. It is the largest ancient amphitheater ever built, and it is still the largest standing amphitheater in the world today despite its age. Its use for the last 1,000 years were rampant with events, festivals, and would even flood its center to reenact naval wars with real ships. How did they get those things in there? I bet that's how they made the bottle in the ship thing, just kinda. And all that water? Just a guy with a giant hose? Yeah, go ahead, turn it on. Yeah, we're gonna be here a while, guys. We gotta push the play.
Number 3, boot and rally. The Urban Dictionary added the old boot and rally back in 2002, but Romans, back in the ancient day, they were way ahead of us. Romans knew how to get down, and they also knew how to get it back up. Yeah, ancient Romans would boot and rally in order to continue eating and drinking. What would normally be a red flag at any house party or event was a sign of respect back then. These banquets, these were social events, okay? They were nothing like Tyler's toga party last Halloween. It's not the same at all. Same amount of puke, not the same theme. Attending these parties was a sign of social standing, so you wanted to be around the longest. You wanted to drink the most, dance the most, converse the most, and also, yeah, puke the most. No playing around in Rome, okay? I wouldn't last 2 hours at one of these. Kyle knows what's up, he's seen it. I bring Tums to the bar now, you know what I mean? I'm always prepared. The solution in ancient Rome was actually quite simple, long before Tums. See, what you would do is, you would excuse yourself from dinner, go across the hall to the vomitorium, then you would grab a feather, any feather you like, and then you would just go, and then put it back, and then go right back to dinner. Then enjoy more lobster, because, hey, now you made room.
Number 2, gladiators. If you've seen the blockbuster hit Gladiator with Russell Crowe, my name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, then you absolutely nailed it, because that's pretty well it. A stew of slaves, lawbreakers, and ex-soldiers, the Gladiator games were one of Rome's most brutal and vibrant live events. Gladiators would be held underground under the Colosseum until they would be called upon to spill the blood of both man and animal in sport. Fighters would be matched based on their size, previous record, skill level, style of fighting, and years of experience, just like the professional contact sports today. Fighting out of the red corner at 195 pounds, the reigning victor, Spartacus! Oh, you're Spartacus? Oh, sorry. No, you're Spartacus. Okay. But it wasn't all thumbs down for these fighters. Gladiators were the celebrities of their time. Yeah, you can take that. There you go. Okay, one. We'll do one. Some gladiators even fought years after earning their freedom. Those years did not seem to be that long with the average lifespan of the gladiator, though, living just to their mid-20s. I mean, it's pretty physical. The event was not just to kill your opponent. In fact, months of training and preparation was had. There was more of a spectacle of sportsmanship then, most of the time wounding their enemy, which would lead to the slow demise of a fighter, usually ranging between anywhere from 8 to 10 fights in their whole career. Come on, dude. 50,000 people cheering you on at the Yankee Stadium? Kyle, Kyle, Kyle. Oh, no, 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 no.
And finally, number 1, fast food. Imagine getting a Happy Meal in 45 BC. You just get a toy of like Spartacus, just like, oh, that's nice, I'll put it on the window. Romans were indulging in fast food before the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 BC. They were having a good time until they weren't. Archaeologists recently excavated a thermopolium in the ruins of what was once thriving city of Pompeii. We found a snack bar in 2019 and it's since been reopened. Yeah, you can now pick up shifts once again at this restaurant that was open thousands of years ago. As of last August, the restaurant, located at the intersection of Silver Wedding Street and Alley of Balconies, they would serve pork, snails, beef, fish, you name it, and the corner also doubled down and crushed fava beans, more often than not mixing them with wine. So it was a good time, it was social. This was bumping on a Saturday night. The closest thing we have to ancient restaurants in Canada now is like coffee time. I don't know, every coffee time in Canada looks like it was damaged by Mount Vesuvius. Looks abandoned. The walls are broken in, nobody's working. I'm like, can I get a coffee? Hi, hello?
Number 10 is the annual exorcism that renders the whole month of May unlucky for marriages. Hence the proverb, bad girls wed in May. AKA Lemuralia, a whole private behind closed doors holiday dedicated to kicking ghosts out of your house. It dates back to hella pagan times, the 6th century BCE, and only seemed to tamper out around the 3rd. Held only on the lucky dates of May 9th, 11th, and 13th, philosopher Ovid tells us in his writings Fasti that Romulus began this tradition to appease the restless and angry spirit, otherwise called lemures in Roman times, of his brother whom he killed. The head of the household was responsible for getting up at night, washing his hands in spring water, and walking through the home with his hands like this. He would either take a mouthful or handful of black beans and then spit them or throw them over his shoulder to the hungry spirits, repeating the following incantation 9 times. I send these with these beans, I redeem me and mine. While dad is doing that, give your kids some pots and pans and tell them to reenact Stomp. The household member's role is to clash bronze pots while repeating, ghosts of my fathers and ancestors, be gone. The householder washes his hands in spring water 3 times, rinse and repeat for 3 days, pun intended. The Lemuralia was meant to help those family members who had died in circumstances that prevented or delayed their admission to the afterlife. This could be dying before your time, or through sudden disease, war, misadventure, or a circumstance that would prevent a proper burial. On the 3rd day, they lighten the energy a little. A merchant's festival and fair was held to ensure a prosperous year for business. Number 9 is how Rome couldn't handle when badass Carthaginian general came a-knockin'. It's the Hannibal invasion. The Carthaginians had lost Rome in the First Punic War, and that was no picnic for anyone involved. The fragile truce called between the nations of Rome and Carthage was tenuous, and Rome was taking more and more control over the Mediterranean Sea by the day, which both economies heavily depended on. Just like in a movie, from the shadows of the concerned Carthaginians came Hannibal, the hot new young general on the scene and the son of Hamilcar, one of the best Carthaginian generals. Now, in the wake of his father's death, with the Roman rage train rolling and something to prove, Hannibal forms his own plan, one that became known as one of the most significant historical events of ancient Rome. They would come to Italy and descend from the Alps. In the spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal led one of the biggest military journeys in history, and what would follow was a series of increasingly catastrophic disasters for the Roman Senate. The first major pitched battle at the river Trebia in December of 218 saw over half the deployed Roman forces eradicated. The Roman consul Flaminius overreacts and pursues Hannibal's army into the hills of Lake Trasimene in June of 217, where they're ambushed and a total of 15,000 Romans are killed. Now, a consul is dead and a significant portion of the army is gone. Instead of recollecting calmly, Rome continues to panic, and the newly elected consuls are given 20,000 Roman men each, as well as 40,000 supplementary troops from Roman allies, stocking an army of around 80,000 men. Imagine being a civilian right now, just everyone is being called for draft men every day, they leave en masse, never return. It's with these forces that the consuls confronted Hannibal at the Roman supply base Cannae, where he had taken. But they did it without taking into account the flat terrain, heavily favored the Carthaginian cavalry. Lo and behold, it's a downright killing spree, and out of the 80,000 men who fought, only 14,500 Romans escaped death or captivity. Let's talk about some more Roman political fumbles. In number 8, the year of 4 emperors. Nero, the emperor who started his reign fabulously only to end it universally despised was the first emperor to definitively take their own life. He did this with a lot of pomp and flair, but also without leaving an heir. This set up an immense power grab into motion, leading to the year of 4 emperors in 69 AD. So let's do a credit run for these guys, shall we? Galba, who follows Nero, pretty much killed every distinguished man without a trial for petty differences. But then, when the people of Rome called upon him to punish 2 corrupt legions, he gave them honors and promotions. He also allowed his friends to wield taxation and condemnation as political favors. He gets killed by his own guards and his body laid in the street until a common soldier sought its head and delivered it to Marcus Salvius Otho. Otho, now elected emperor, immediately has Vitellius on it, refusing all offers of peace settlements and demanding a battle. Otho loses 40,000 men to him, and the man who tells him this takes his life at Otho's feet. Otho couldn't tough it, so he said goodbye to his loved ones, dispersed his wealth, took his own life. The Senate immediately hands Vitellius the throne to spare themselves more battle. Was a gluttonous dirtbag. Disregarding democracy, he mimicked Nero in setting himself up to be the supreme power. He held his position for 8 months before the founder of the Flavian dynasty, Titus Flavius, suddenly had the legions of Syria, Alexandria, Moesia, Pannonia, Illyricum declaring him the emperor, and the terrified Vitellius disguises himself with rags and tries to escape the city, but fails. Next is the emperor who essentially lived as if in a cartoon. Number 7 is Caligula's reign. Living in Rome at the same time as this guy would be a nightmare on the sole basis alone. His favorite phrase was, "Remember, I have the right to do anything to anybody," because that is what you want to hear from your leader, and he was someone who took it quite literally. This included banging his friends' wives, or the torment and subsequent killing of high-ranking senators who dared to disagree with him. He even turned killing into a sport and just attacked people at random. Caligula famously caused a famine by draining the Roman treasury, having built vast monuments to his own greatness. After raising taxes to get some more petty cash, Caligula's spending quickly became out of control. In one famous incident, he arranged for hundreds of merchant ships to form a 3-mile-long floating bridge across the bay, which he galloped back and forth across on his horse for 2 days wearing a golden cape. Caligula wasn't like this at the beginning of his reign, when he led a series of political reforms and even recalled all the exiles from outside of Rome, but something shifted after a few months, which can be attributed to maybe a serious illness, leading Caligula to become increasingly erratic and deranged. He ordered his men to attack the beach and declared himself a god, appearing in public dressed as various gods and demigods, and he also removed the heads of gods' statues to put his own atop. He was the first Roman emperor to be killed in a coup. On to number 6, which is the crisis of the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic lasted for nearly 500 years, but the crisis of the Roman Republic was nowhere near as long, rather a decades of political instability that fed social unrest from 134 to 44 BC. During this period, Rome was often at war with its neighbors while simultaneously dealing with crippling civil wars and coups as aristocrats tried to hang on to their exclusive rights and privileges against the pressure from the rest of society. So many captured people were brought into the country, it created an influx of free labor which hurt the lower classes and disrupted the agricultural system, forcing small farmers to sell their land. Wealthy people bought votes and gave favors to their friends. Bribery and corruption were rampant and led to commoners distrusting Senate, and without a police force, crime was out of control. When Rome's conquests declined, so did their sources of income. This decrease in money resulted in a loss for the people of Rome and created enormous stress on that economy. Officials began to tax their citizens, furthering the peasant rage. The rise of Julius Caesar as a dictator led to civil war from 49 to 45 BC and saw Roman armies fighting each other in Italy, Spain, Greece, and Egypt. This, along with economic problems, government corruption, crime, and private arms, all led to the eventual fall of the Roman Republic in 27 BCE.
Number 5, the Black Banquet. A prank that went down in history. Don't worry, this is nothing like GOT's Red Wedding, thank goodness. Emperor Domitian had a pretty sick sense of humor and decided to host a party about it. In 90 AD, he invited a crowd of aristocrats to a banquet at Palatine Hill. When they arrived, the entire palace was decorated in black. Black velvet drapes, marble, everything was painted black, like the Rolling Stones song. Even the food was black and everything was illuminated by funeral lamps. Naked serving boys were painted from head to toe in black paint and served food and drink to all the guests. When they sat down, their place marks were tombs with their names on it, and instead of lush couches, they sat on cement slabs. So basically he was like, yeah, sit in your own grave. Domitian had killed several senators in the past, so everyone believed that they they were never gonna get out of there alive. It was like a huge metaphor for their own deaths. The emperor himself babbled about death and decay the entire night, so after the party was over and the guests made it home with their necks intact, Dominion sent gift baggies with their tombstones and onyx plates, and a now clean serving boy ready to do their bidding. Turns out the whole thing was a prank and the emperor was back at the palace laughing his butt off. Number 4, Bacchanalia. The party that was so wild, it got banned. One word, orgies. The Romans dug that kind of kinky shindig, but they like to pretend they didn't. Bacchanalia, the Bacchae, is a term used to describe a drunken, debaucherous party at frat houses or sororities, which isn't far off from the heyday. The Bacchanal celebrates the god Dionysus, also known as Bacchus, literally the god of wine and a damn good time. The celebration could include massive feasts, ritual parades and performances, and people carrying clusters of grapes around, and of course, wine. Lots and lots of wine. It used to just be held by women 3 times a year, but soon men were slowly admitted to the festivities and they started making it happen about 5 times a month. But this was the breeding ground for scandal, as it was rumored orgies and even human sacrifice occurred. So they were banned in 186 BCE, and if you ban something, you'll only make it more popular, so the celebrations continued covertly. So if you're into that kind of stuff, maybe forgo the human sacrifice, but there it is. Number 3, power play party. I've never lived within the aristocracy. I'm a blue collar gal. I'm never gonna know what it's like to be that rich, but I'm pretty sure this kind of who can throw the bigger party mentality hasn't really changed. In ancient Rome, parties were an opportunity to show off the amount of power a nobleman had. As soon as guests arrived, the extravagance and the rarity of the food, the vessels with which they were presented, were all judged as soon as they were seen. Wine goblets and jugs had to be functional yet exquisite, made from luxurious materials like gold, silver, and precious stones. Back then, a middle-class family could afford silverware, so imagine what the nobles could do. This display of wealth played the long game, and it could mean political favors could be made down the road. So, sneaky sneaky. Number 2, Party Island. This is where it gets really dark. Ever sipped on a Capri Sun? Well, this story may taint that memory, so fair warning. The island of Capri became a rich retreat for the Roman aristocracy, known for its sadistic debauchery. Emperor Tiberius laid claim to this island as a haven for his horrendous and horrific behavior. He brought really young, too young male and female people of the night to serve him at his villa. The island became a kind of party place with absolutely no limits. From orgies in the caves to tormenting his servants on the rack as entertainment, Tiberius seemed to be the god Pan incarnate. In fact, he acted like it too. He made all of his participants slaves dress up as nymphs and goats while performing lewd acts. The island even became known as Goat Island, with Tiberius being called the Old Goat. Ugh. Unless you enjoy dangerous games and gross parties, this definitely wasn't the party island fit for anyone. And last but not least, number 1, Caligula. Caligula's parties. Let's not go there. If you're a fan of Roman history, then you are familiar with the 2 most horrific emperors that ever were. One of them was Caligula. Though he started out pretty good, after an extreme bout of fever, his disposition entirely changed. Maybe it was because of the lead, we don't know. Many believed he was insane, as his cruelty knew no bounds, even when it came to joyous occasions. Caligula's thing was that he liked to embarrass the wives of his officials for some reason, and also his officials. He would force specifically married couples to his banquets, and then steal the wives away throughout the night and then violate them against their wishes. But his torment doesn't end there. He would then relay to the entire party everything that he did in graphic detail and enjoy the frozen shock on everyone's faces because they couldn't do anything about it. It's no wonder he was eventually assassinated. Even at a party, this guy knew how to kill the mood. He wasn't the only emperor to turn the dial on creepy, Tiberius, when the party started, but if you had to choose whose party to go to, this one plus Tiberius, both of them, just don't go near them. Go to another time frame. Just imagine it otherwise.
Kicking off the list at number 10, Gladiator blood. Okay, nice and thirsty this morning, so let's talk about gladiator blood so we can get nice and hydrated for this video. When Charlie Sheen started talking smack about drinking dragon blood, everybody looked at him like this guy was insane. But back then, back in ancient Roman days, if you boasted about drinking gladiator blood, that's great, you were on the right track. Something's working for you, pal. Keep it up. Ancient Romans believed that gladiators had the literal heart of a lion, and to be fair, they were in immaculate shape and they looked like lions with their glorious hair. I'm attracted to Romans, most of them. So the thought process here, being extremely superstitious, was that if you drank said gladiator blood, whatever disease you had would soon be cured. Yes, the strong heart of a lion blood. Yeah, if you have some epilepsy, Roman physicians would tell you to drink some blood, like you're a vampire. Yeah, here you go. Here you go, Edward. Enjoy. Hope you feel better. Number 9, you're in trouble. Recently, we did a list on dark medical practices used in history, and in that list, we mentioned briefly about how urine was used by ancient Romans to whiten their smile. Yeah, fresh breath, not guaranteed. Actually, this time at all. It's really not. It's the opposite, in fact. Well, to dive deeper into this gross, disgusting fact, ancient Romans also used urine to wash their clothes. Yep. That's so gross. I was like, I hope no one peeing on them. There we go. After they were done washing up, they would mask the smell, or at least try to, with leaves. Yeah, they would use bay leaves. Yeah, they didn't use soap because, well, the amount of ammonia in urine did the trick, so there was no need at that point. Yeah. Lye was also used to clean clothes at this time, but it was too pricey. So plan B was to head down to the, washrooms, the old ancient laundromat. Same thing, really. They're pretty close. And then everybody would catch up while, stomping and urinating and cleaning out their clothes. It was a good time. Number 8, new hair, new me. As soon as I cut my hair, I'm not gonna lie, I felt great. There's less weight on the neck, I could be more free in my silly movements when I do these lists. Glowing up these days is easier than ever. The tutorials on YouTube as well, you can learn how to do your brows while hearing true crime. It's amazing what we have nowadays. The Romans, not that easy. They had to do a little more work back then. If you were an ancient Roman and you wanted to show off the new you to your ex, maybe you're at a vomitorium party and you see your ex maybe perhaps, how would you dye your hair? How would you get their attention? How do you show Romulus that blondes do in fact do it better, right? Romans would have to use goat fat and beechwood ashes to bring out those highlights, yeah. Maybe it's goat fat, maybe it's Maybelline, maybe it's disgusting. It's definitely disgusting. Again, like those crazy Roman parties, this was a symbol of status, right? If your hair didn't reek of goat fat, who are you? You're not on the list, honey. Goat fat or bust. I don't speak broke. See ya. Emperor Claudius, his third wife, Valeria, apparently she once dyed her hair blonde and painted her entire body gold, and then had a contest to see who could hook up with the most Romans in one night. Yeah, Bachelor in Paradise, Pompeii edition. Tune in, tonight at 8. Number 7, party hard. The term boot and rally was added to the Urban Dictionary back in 2002, pretty recent. But Romans, they were doing that a long time ago. They were riding that wave out a long, long time ago. They were ahead of the game. They knew how to get down. All those ancient parties, well, rather, they knew how to get it back up. Ancient Romans would often make themselves throw up in order to continue eating and drinking because it was a social status. Yeah, what would normally be a red flag at a house party was a sign of respect back then. But it was business. These parties were literally business meetings. These long, exhausting banquets, attending these was a sign of social standing. So you wanted to be around the longest. You wanted to drink the most. You wanted to dance the most. And you wanted to, ideally, puke the most. Those are the coolest Romans in town, right? You ever see a Roman gagging? He's getting some stuff done in the city. He's like, oh, excuse me. The solution back then was to throw it up and then continue. So you can, excuse yourself from dinner, go to the vomitorium, right across from the dining room. How convenient. Must be a nice breeze rolling through there, I'm sure. But then you would go to this room, grab a feather, and then tickle, thy throat, and then make room for even more lobster. Yeah, they have a thing that holds feathers. So you just go in and go, oh, a blue one. And then you shove it down your mouth, and then put it back in. After you dry it off first, you gotta put it back in. Number 6, bathroom hangouts. Bathroom lighting is key when you go out, okay? Those 1 a.m. selfies have to look good. That's the whole point, or else why are we going out? Why am I putting on shoes, right? If the curls aren't working, I'm not going outside, that's it. In ancient Roman times, hanging out in the bathroom with your friends was common. They didn't have any neon lights or anything cool. They didn't have Arctic monkeys playing or any cool atmospheres. It was just a lot of bricks. And also, it of course smelled really bad. They didn't have the Charmin Ultra less is more lifestyle either. They had to use sticks with sponges to wipe. And yeah, they also, same with the feathers, they had to share said sticks. Socializing in these ancient toilets was like socializing at a Starbucks. It was normal, it was business, you would spend hours here and you got stuff done. Groups of Romans would discuss business, politics, military strategies, you name it. All the while there's a dude in the corner just taking a shit. Romans believed the goddess Glaucina was the guardian of the toilet drain system. Glauca Maxima translates to big drain. So when you invent the flushing toilet, yeah, you're like, this is some higher power. You can call your toilets whatever you want, you know? Just maybe don't call any more meetings there, because it smells a little bad.
Going hand in hand with that last point is number 5, dowry on a finger. You know that whole selfish notion that if they really love you, they'll spend a fortune on a ring because that's what you're worth? Guess where that comes from? Creepy, right? Nowadays, it can be obvious from a ring how much someone paid for it, but back in ancient Rome, looking at a ring was how you established how much a woman was worth. And you could base how much you should respect her on that. Cheap ring, that means a small dowry and an unworthy woman. Yikes. In fact, author Karen K. Hirsch notes that rings were often used for this purpose in regular business transactions in Rome, making it very possible they entered the wedding ceremony with that mindset around the 15th or 16th century. The groom would offer a ring as a sign of his serious intention, offering up some collateral that the bride could keep if he decided to back out of the engagement. Rings were sometimes used as a deposit on the expected dowry or as a simple payment to the bride as part of her acquisition. For number 4, if you got some bad luck, bouquet it. So, having a pantheon of multiple gods is going to create some strong superstitions. Gods were jealous and had to be pacified with gifts and praise so that they would behave and grant wishes. Sometimes these gifts took the form of a handful of wheat or garlands and fragrant herbs. The origin of the bridal bouquet stems back to ancient Rome when bridal couples would weave greenery and blossoms into garlands and crowns scented with roses or orange blossoms, adding herbs to honor the gods and promote fertility and good fortune, says Valerie Gittleman. Strands of ivory illustrated the strong bond of matrimony and fidelity, while white blossoms symbolize sweetness and happiness. Sheaves of wheat, for example, symbolize plenty and good harvests, i.e. fertility, which alongside faithfulness were the topmost virtues of ancient marriage. These garlands would be found on the altar spaces, on the groom's head, wound into the intricate 6-vestal bridal hairstyle, and naturally in the cluster the bride carries, all meant to ward off evil spirits that might try to harm her. Speaking of hair and bridal beauty, how about the Roman candle for number 3? I talked about the flammeum in the last video about Roman marriage, but more so about what it represents and its purposes. As you may know, had you seen it, the flammeum is a oak yellow color. However, it didn't start this way, rather as a vibrant orange-red color designed to look like fire so it would scare off evil spirits. Also, it does explain the name flammeum to you. This flammeum also covered the bride's entire body in a 360 style, and originally they were weighed down with like heavy leaf garlands, precious stones, real rocks if you're broke. This was to prevent her, or at least try to slow her down if she was to try and run away. Why the change to yellow? Sun fading on veils passed down through the centuries. The concern for evil spirits lessened. People liked the color mustard yellow. I don't know, take your pick. What stayed the same was having to use a billion pins to keep the damn thing on. Thankfully, the 6-braid vestal virgin hairstyle was conducive to that, but it was also conducive to hiding weapons. Circling us back to the Sabine and captured bride concept. Before a bride was allowed into the marriage bed, it became code that all jewelry that could be used as a weapon by the bride would have to be removed, including hairpins, bracelets, rings, and necklaces. Turns out some smart ladies kept some blades between their veil and scalp to protect themselves from their unwanted husbands once behind closed doors. I'm sure their Sabine ancestors would have been proud of them. This one's a little odd, but you may now kiss the priest, in at number 2. Pre-Christianity, kissing in Rome was actually a greeting. Before you picture a hot and sloppy makeout sesh, that's not the case. I mean a peck or little brushy brush of the lips. It was done between strangers, nobility, and family. Hell, they had to put laws in place to get people to stop laying them on each other when pandemics would break out so less people would die. It wasn't a romantic thing in the slightest. Common for friends to kiss one another's closed eyelids, necks, and mouths, and considered a great privilege to greet members of your own family with a kiss. This rule was not to be broken or followed incorrectly. As Christianity took root in ancient Rome, the act of kissing became shamed alongside nudity, intercourse, and just about anything that was natural. What did remain was the kiss of peace. These were initially acceptable between men and women, but over time, Rome went from a kiss-friendly to no-tongue action township. Because God forbid you kiss someone thanks for the loaf of bread you bought and feel a tingle somewhere. I know you bought bread from her every day for the last 13 years before now and kissed her thanks every time, but you never know. Today could be the day you defy God and embrace the devil. Tisk tisk, Romans. Anyways, jokes aside, despite the casual greeting kiss and the romantic kisses before marriage being banned, the kiss of peace remained, and one of the times that kiss happened was at the marriage ceremony, where the priest would turn to the groom and absolutely lay one on the guy. After that, the groom has to turn to the bride and give her some sloppy tongue action next. Idea was that the priest passed a blessing through his mouth to the grooms and the groom would pass it to the bride. Thus why the groom can kiss the bride and not the other way around. And last but not least, it's everyone's favorite gals, the bridesmaids. Number 1. Bridesmaids are as much a sight to behold as the bride herself, mostly because back in the day, they dressed almost exactly the same as the bride. Complete opposite of the downright offensive thing some of y'all have your best friends wear. Girl, if you love her, you wouldn't make her wear that shade of pink that she can't. Anyways, the Romans believed that the bride, being so pretty, is easy prey for vengeful spirits that would harm her. Thus, the bouquets, the flammium, and now the bridesmaids, aka decoy brides. These maidens' purposes were literally to confuse evil spirits. They would dress identical to each other in an outfit somewhat similar to the bride's own. Since the bridesmaids would be surrounding the bride and look so similar to one another, it was believed the evil spirits would become confused and fly off somewhere else. Reader's Digest also noted the use of bridesmaids in a similar fashion to the best man, confusing rival lovers or even criminals seeking to take the bride. As a result, the tradition of bridesmaids wearing identical dresses to the bride persisted until the 1880s. Of course, modern bridesmaids who consider the role less of an honor than a job with the terrible uniform should consider something else noted by Reader's Digest. In ancient times, bridesmaids were literally the bride's maids. At least these days, you're getting drunk on a yacht with her.
Number 10. Decemviri, the law of 12 tables. Well, actually the word means 10. 10 men, actually. Those special 10 would be the appointed men who would consider themselves the first ever lawmakers. The earliest attempts to create a code of law was the law of 12 tables. A commission of 10 men, are also known as the Decemviri, was appointed 455 BC to draw up a code of law-binding rules on both patrician and plebeian, which would be strictly enforced. Some of these laws included simple laws like, you don't break your word. If the army or king calls on you, you gotta go. And of course, if you hit or hurt someone, you get hit or hurt back. And you owe us some money. This system was the first in its place, holding people responsible for the things that they did and said in Rome. Strategic, fundamental, and important laws like, hey, no crying at funerals, alright? You burn my corn, I'm gonna burn your corn, and I get to burn you. And yeah, no meetings at night. It's dark. Okay, so they missed their mark on a couple of them, but a couple of those laws still stuck around.
Number 9. Field surgery. The Romans were fierce on the battlefield, but they were also extremely handy. Who would have thought? This was the first time in history where quick surgeries were performed on the battlefield under the leadership of Augustus. Not Augustus Mayhew, it's a different Augustus, but he's also really helpful, like one time a year. Ancient Roman medics invented hemostatic tourniquets and surgical clamps. Yeah, guy invented clamps. Imagine that on a resume. Roman field doctors would also perform physicals on new warriors. Yeah, they would also combat the spread of disease. Although they were going to war and were constantly being patched up, the Roman military would often live longer than the average folk, because these military men were constantly being disinfected. They were checking their camps all day. Masks are hard in 2020, but the Romans were disinfecting the Colosseum. Nice, we'll get there one day. Maybe.
Number 8. The name Rome. We kinda got into this a little bit about those brothers Remus and Romulus. This barbaric history is loose and from many sources, so I'm gonna kinda sum it up into broad statements. Two brothers, didn't like each other, kept fighting, raised by a wolf and a bird. That's pretty much it. We have seen what these two have looked like. Every statue and painting of these two is always like one of them stone cold Steve Austining the other one. One built a wall and the other mocked him and jumped over that wall, and then there was only one. I feel like I made a sandcastle once and Taylor stepped on it, and I can absolutely see how the city was formed. Flawless victory. Yeah, that sounds like brotherly love to me. Rome deriving from its name Romulus, the victor in this legendary sibling quarrel, giving the city its official name. Hey, you got the god of war as your dad, and the mother of all gods and goddesses as your mom? There's gonna be some feeling of purpose just lingering around. Guess I could just make a wall. And with a couple drywall holes later, with the death and defeat of his brother Remus, Romulus claimed his position as king and named the city after himself. Selfish much? He ain't heavy, baby. He's my brother.
Number 7. Daily acts. In a time before Twitter or Facebook, how else do we get our fake news, right? How do we share our aunt's nonsense? How do we do it? 131 BC. This marked the first time a newspaper was ever used. Well, they're referred to as daily acts at this point, or acta diurna. The saying, written in stone, couldn't have been more historically accurate in this case. See, these texts containing information on military or civil issues, death notices, gladiatorial events, you name it, these were commonly written on metal or stone. Your morning news etched into a stone. Imagine the crossword section in 131 BC. Hey honey, who's the neighbor in Simpsons? Flanders. Nice, that's it. Ping! Ping! Is that an F? Ping! It took time and effort. It was exhausting just to get one notice out to the public. So you best take these notes seriously, okay? Imagine YouTube comments written in stone. Took a guy 6 business days to write it, so he meant it.
Number 6, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was a Roman general and statesman, a member of the first triumvirate. Caesar led the Roman armies in the Gallic Wars, which, well, we've seen and heard about these battles that Julius Caesar led. It's the organized outfit of shiny metal and red, moving slowly and swiftly through the Gauls like a man-made tank before defeating his political rival Pompey the Great, another military leader, and also the husband of Caesar's daughter Julia. Okay, there it is, yeah. That's why he became his nemesis. Political differences. Yeah. Due to these ongoing internal civil wars between the two leaders, Julius Caesar eventually killed Pompey in battle and became dictator of Rome. This was until his assassination in 44 BC. Oh, mighty Caesar, dost thou lie so low? Are all thy conquests, glories, triumphs, spoils shrunk to this little measure? Fare thee well. Antony, Act 3, Scene 1. Hey man, eye for an eye. You read the rules. He played a crucial role in the events that led to the Roman Empire and remains one of the brightest and bravest military leaders the world has ever seen. His story can be seen and heard top to tail in William Shakespeare's play simply titled Julius Caesar.
Part of what dictated the Stola, however, was number 5, the stupid Oppian Law. So, in 215 BC, the Roman men who were overtaxed passed the Oppian Law, named after Gaius Oppius, the tribune of the plebeians who instituted it. And it was passed 1 year after Rome's catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Carthaginian general Hannibal. To summarize it in the laziest terms, Oppian Law was initiated by a group of poor people seeking revenge against the wrong source. Instead of trying to coup their government for the taxation, they lashed out at women and their already minimal freedoms. This new Oppian Law limited Roman women's allowance to ½ an ounce of gold and prohibited them from wearing dresses, multicolored garments, or anything with purple borders, as purple dye was very expensive. It also prohibited women from riding in a carriage except on a long journey, pregnant or otherwise. 20 years after it's imposed, Marcus Fundanius and Lucius Valerius, the tribunes of the people, brought a motion to repeal the Oppian Law. Noblemen came forward hoping to persuade or dissuade them. A crowd of both supporters and opponents filled the Capitoline Hill. The matrons and maids of Rome, whom neither council, shame, husband, and father's orders could keep them at home, proceeded to blockade every street in the city and every entrance to the Forum. As the men opposing came down to the Forum, the women tried to reason with them to let them too have back the luxuries they'd enjoyed before. The Republic was thriving, and that everyone's private wealth has increased with every day. When the speeches for and against the law had been made, even more women poured into the public the next day when the vote was to be cast. Together, they besieged the door of the Brutuses, who were vetoing the decision to repeal the law, and they didn't stop until the tribunes changed their minds. The women of Rome, as a collective, forced the men to repeal their biased law. Number 4 is a bit of a strange one. It's what's best. Wealthy Roman women didn't believe in breastfeeding their own children. Instead, they handed them over to a wet nurse, usually a prisoner or a hired free woman who was contracted to provide this service. Soranus, the influential author of a 2nd century work on gynecology, prescribed that a wet nurse's milk might be preferable in the days after birth, on the grounds that the mother could become too exhausted to feed. He did not approve of feeding on demand and recommended that solids such as bread soaked in grape juice should be introduced at 6 months. Soranus also pointed to the possible benefits of employing Greek wet nurses, who could pass on the gift of her mother's tongue to her charge. Did he think that she would be able to give language through breast milk? You know what? Never mind. This flew in the face of advice from most Roman physicians and philosophers who always suggested that mother's milk was the best for both the child and the mother's health and moral character on the grounds that wet nurses may pass on, not kidding, their crappy flaws or personality to the baby. These same men also usually pitched that women who did not feed their own child were lazy, vain, and unnatural, and only cared about possible damages to their figures. The hatred of women was very real. Alright, well, let's get away from the terrible medical beliefs of ancient men. Number 3 will be the OG hair extensions. Historical evidence from Pompeii suggests hairdressing shops known as torresos existed. It makes sense. Roman women did have certain hairstyles expected of them based off class or marital status. E.g., unmarried women put their hair up in woolen bands when going out and added a gauzy hair veil to boot. While single women were expected to have their hair up, it doesn't mean it couldn't be styled. They pepper in braids, twists, and curls. More noble or prestigious women could arrange their hair more elaborately in various styles such as long curls and waves. The curls would be made by dipping tongs in fire. Cool, right? But one specifically weird little tidbit is that brunette, ginger, and raven hair Roman women had a fixation with blonde hair. This interest was caused when Roman warriors brought back captured women from France and Germany and quickly became incorporated into the imagery of their gods and goddesses, who oftentimes had dark hair or the more heavenly and revered color of ginger before this point. The Roman ladies would dye their hair blonde with pastes and powders in order to copy the blonde hair of their working girls and captives, but the color would eventually come off as they hadn't figured out the chemical composition to permanently bleach hair yet. To solve this vanity issue, the hair of the blonde working and captive girls was chopped off so Roman women could wear it as wigs. Might as well make number 2 all about the Roman face mask then. Why? Because it was gross. Just so gross. Y'all ready? Homegirls back in the day made face masks composed of sheep's wool soaked in a soupy paste mixture of animal placenta, excrement, and urine, as well as sulfur, abrasive oyster shells, and bile. Whose bile? God, okay. And this is before you'd whiten your skin, another trend started by the arrival of the pale French and German captive girls. They did this with lead, dung, and whatever marl is. Want to reduce wrinkles? Get out of Canada, or anywhere under the crown, because the Roman women would kill swans, which is a crime under British rule, and use their fat. This was all part of Mundus Muliebris, which translated it means women's world, a reference to women's fineries in the ancient Roman world. This would include face and skin care, but also dresses, jewelry, hair care, all described in Latin literature by the famed Cicero, who noted it alongside Mundi Omatam, aka the ordered beauty of the world, and Kale Omatus, celestial adornment. See, there's some non-deprecating writing on Roman ladies. Good job making it over to the very low bar there, Cicero. Seneca, not so much. The depressing dude was quick to blasphemize makeup and say it led to the decline of Rome. And of course, for number 1, we will visit Sappho on Lesbos Island. The Greek poet Sappho, who lived from 630 to 570 BCE, lived on the island of Lesbos just off the west coast of what is now Turkey, and composed poems that live on in infamy to this day, as she speaks very openly about her homoerotic attraction and even implied intercourse amongst women. These poems are mostly written from the perspective of herself as a character. But what did the Greeks and Romans think of this? How could these poems be so widely adored that they're remembered to this date? So, like I've mentioned, men wrote Roman history, so they weren't particularly interested in what women got up to when men weren't around. As a result, we know little about same-gender relations of women in Rome, but what we do know is telling. The Greeks and the Romans as a society, of course, recognize that some people are more interested in one gender over another, but the general consensus was not to assume this preference was a fixed aspect of a person's identity. Instead of thinking about gendered attraction in terms of genders a person was attracted to, the Greeks and Romans cared about the role a person took during the act of intercourse with an individual. For some Romans, a same-gender relationship between women was the most confusing thing imaginable, as well as a little bit disturbing. They had trouble comprehending the possibilities of the relationship given that neither of those involved a man and could naturally take the male role. Layman's terms, these empires believed the act of intercourse was a free adult man proving his masculinity by dominating the territory of an inferior person. If there was no man involved, then there was no real intercourse happening. Therefore, women having relations, let alone extramarital affairs with one another, wasn't something men needed to worry about.
Number 10, parties of poison. Hindsight is 2020, which I find more ironic than ever since the whole thing that happened and is continuing to happen. Today we know that lead, especially in large doses, is not good. It's poison. But a lot of the pipes that the Romans used in their plumbing were made from lead. Their water had 100 times more lead in it than the water that came from the springs, which means every time they drank water, they were poisoning themselves. Some side effects include behavioral changes as well as weakening organs and vital signs, etc., which may explain some of the more questionable emperor behaviors or the fall of the Roman Empire, because people got nuts. But to add insult to injury, the Romans used to sweeten their wine with something called sapa. Sapa is lead acetate, the sugar of lead, and it's also a salt, which is confusing, and therefore poison. Since Romans could down as much as 2 liters of wine in one sitting, they were slowly poisoning themselves, first with water, then with the wine. Speaking of wine, moving on to number 9, we have You Better Love Wine. If you're a vodka or a beer person, you might not fit in while partying with the Romans, especially if you hate wine. Wine was the lifeblood of ancient Roman parties. Wine was drunk at every stage of the Roman party, but it had to be diluted with hot or cold water. Unlike how we drink wine today, which would be crazy if you were to dilute it. Whoa. It was looked down upon to drink wine in its purest form. It was served out with ladles, usually by naked and attractive male slaves. To heat the water, the Romans used special boilers, but if you really wanted to be bougie, they would add snow to make it cold. Considering they didn't have fridges back then, imagine the lengths they would have to go to keep the snow cold. Beyond temperature, Romans absolutely drooled for calda and mulsum. Calda was great for cold nights. It was kind of like a mulled wine. It was served hot and infused with spices. Mulda was infused with honey and a lot sweeter. I want to try and make both. Maybe I will on my Instagram. Let me know if I should in the comments below. Minus the lead, of course. Number 8, seating charts. If you have ever been involved in a wedding, you know how important a seating chart is. Or like even in school, when you're like assigned desks, it's a big deal. You could end up sitting next to your uncomfortable cousin or beside your smelly Aunt Sue. It could determine whether the conversation flows or it's stagnant the entire night. Ugh, hate that. Romans understood the matchmaking game when it came to banquets. It was a pretty big deal. Where you sat determined your station and overall how liked you were. They had a 3-couch system called the triclinium. The most honored guests would sit on the couch in the center next to the hosts on the right. But if you were on the couch on the left, it kinda meant that you weren't as big of a deal. Sorry. Eventually, as parties got bigger, so did the 3-couch rule extend to a huge semicircular couch in the middle that could hold about 12 people. Number 7, gladiator fights. We just did a video on this, Taylor and I, go check it out. Now, parties weren't just about eating, drinking, and socializing, there had to be entertainment, of course. Roman parties were designed around the 5 senses: taste, touch, smell, sight, and hearing. So of course there were the ancient Roman bards jamming out some earworms, but what was there to look at? You could only watch someone play the harp for so long. Next up on the entertainment list was acrobats, dancing girls, even mimes, which I was surprised to learn, plus trained exotic animals. If you were more like the charcuterie and like a quiet evening kind of person, you might enjoy poetry readings. But what really got the party started was an epic gladiatorial battle. Nothing like putting sharp objects in drunk people's hands. But that wasn't all they did. Parties were a big deal and nobles loved to outdo each other, so sometimes they went too far. More than once it got out of hand, but the most famous was during the reign of Emperor Elagabalus. He wanted to shower his dinner guests with flowers, so he built a false ceiling filled with them, but the flowers somehow ended up smothering some of his guests to death because he just kind of went overboard. Death by Roses. That's a poem title right there. Stick to poetry nights, my friends. Number 6, Saturnalia. One of the most popular Roman festivals. It was kind of like an early Christmas celebration, kind of, except it wasn't at all. It was actually about the god Saturn, not Christ. Oops, but it did take place in December 17th to be precise, for 3 days. But people loved it so much, it soon got extended to 7, a whole week. All work and businesses were suspended, so better do your shopping on the 16th. Slaves were even temporarily free to do as they pleased, even moral restrictions were eased. A mock king was chosen, and candles, wax fruit, wax statues were all given as presents. The practice of candle giving was to symbolize the sun returning after the winter solstice. A statue of Saturn bound at the feet would be untied and invited to join the party. The houses were adorned with wreaths and greenery, kinda like Christmas, and singing, dancing, gambling were all common features, so kind of like Mardi Gras and Christmas combined.
Number 5, play that lyre to the fire. While we're talking about Nero, he actually has a mystery all of his own. Nero was very famously a fan of music. He would often sing and play instruments, and he was also a fan of being utterly insane. ending lives and forcing people to party all night, have massive parties, and eat until they puked. So when you hear a rumor that this crazy emperor may have caused the Great Fire of Rome that destroyed a lot of the city on July 18th in the year 64, you might believe it. And you might even believe the rumor that he also played the lyre while the city burned. It just kind of all checks out for how crazy he is, but obviously we have no evidence of that actually happening. Neither of those two rumors can be proven, especially not now, 1,958 years later. What we do know is that the emperor did benefit quite a bit from the destruction the fire caused. It allowed him to change the aesthetics of the city, persecute thousands of Christians, and introduce new building codes. It also turns out Nero may have been 35 miles away in Antium, but I mean, prove it! You can't. I can't. Number 4. Ham Hill. Ham Hill in England is the location of an archaeological dig by the Universities of Cambridge and Cardiff, where we made the crazy discovery of the graves of a lot of people, dating back to the time in history when Romans made their way into England. The part that is so alarming, other than finding a pile of corpses, is that these particular bodies had been stripped of their exterior layers and chopped up. It's gruesome. But oddly, most of the skeletons found here actually belonged to women, and most of which were women in their early 20s. But this wouldn't be a mystery if those were all the facts. We actually don't know what happened here. The obvious answer is some kind of mass life-ending escapade, but why, damn it, why? We don't know. Number 3, Hard Talker. Surprise! You've met the afterlife. Were you a good person? Well, if you weren't, if you were a threat to your community, say in ancient Rome, then it's pretty likely you would have been buried face down. So there, take that. Hold up, they cut out your tongue and put a stone in your mouth? What in the Gaius Octavius Caesarion? What is going on here? That's probably what the team who unearthed the grave of a man from a Northamptonshire site dating back to Roman Britain probably said. They found a man who was buried face down in his grave, missing his tongue with a stone in its place. Pretty odd. Infection in the bones of his jaw show it was removed while he was still alive. And the practice of replacing a missing body part with another object was definitely known to happen in Roman Britain, although it was rather rare. The only thing is we have absolutely no idea what this man had done. Maybe he just really talked too much. Maybe he lost his tongue to something completely unrelated to his delifing, and this stone was just to replace it. We don't actually know, and there is no evidence to tell us. Theories? Number 2. Skulls of London. I'm not really sure how this happens, how it was discovered, or anything, but in 1988, 39 skulls were excavated really close to the Museum of London in London. Those 39 skulls were alarming enough, but the 39 soon expanded into hundreds of skulls. Now, possible theories included that the skulls belonged to executed criminals, gladiators, or even soldiers that had done the Monty Python, run away! Most of the skulls seem to have been from men, and most indicated that they suffered rather brutal offings. Some people think the skulls were dumped in display pits. Some people think they were placed there purposely. To make matters worse, not too far away we also discovered what seems to be an ancient Roman cooking pot with bits of humans in it. All of this creepy stuff was found in an area no bigger than a swimming pool, which makes it very obvious that it was all a part of the same thing, possibly part of some crazy Roman cult. Maybe it's all just a big coincidence. We don't have the evidence to know. I don't think I could really tell you exactly what in the name of Mark Antony went on here, but I do know that it were not good. Number 1. Mole warfare. Who would have thought chemical warfare would make for a great story? Especially 2,000-year-old ancient chemical warfare. Back in the Roman city of Dura Europus in Syria, a siege took place between the Roman and the Persian forces. During said battle, the Persians dug siege tunnels underneath the walls of the Roman city. The Romans knew and built their own tunnels to cut them off. Problem with tunnels like that is you have absolutely no idea of where exactly the opposing team is going to show up. The Romans ended up building their tunnel higher than the Persians did, so you got like this kind of situation going on. Now, archaeological digs have discovered about 19 Roman soldiers in these tunnels. But it seems that these soldiers were not stabbed to cause their demise, but instead, they seem to have suffocated. Well, how the heck did that happen? According to archaeologist Simon James, he believes that the Persians actually allowed the Romans to dig into their tunnel. and then use the elevated position with a sort of chimney effect to set a mix of bitumen and sulfur on fire and let the fumes do the deed. But, and say it with me, there is absolutely no evidence of this. Yes, good, you've caught on. Very nice. Alrighty, bees, that's all the game show information I have for you today. Learn something new? Have some theories? Leave it all below.